May 3rd, 2024. Grizzly Malls, 22, tourists at Yellowstone Hot Springs. The chartered bus from Windy City Adventures rolled through the Roosevelt Arch at 2:47 p.m. Mountain Time, its diesel engine echoing off the limestone columns as driver Marcus Chen downshifted for the winding road ahead. Behind him, 43 passengers pressed their faces to tinted windows, cameras already clicking at their first glimpse of America's oldest national park. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Gardiner River Valley, and the snow-capped peaks of the Gallatin Range stretched endlessly toward a crystalline sky that promised perfect weather for their three-day Yellowstone adventure. Sarah Michelle Rodriguez, the tour group's lead coordinator, stood at the front of the bus, gripping the metal handrail as she addressed her charges through the crackling PA system. At 28, Sarah had been leading wilderness tours for 6 years, ever since graduating from Northern Illinois University with degrees in recreation management and environmental science. Her voice carried the practiced enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved sharing the natural world with others, even if most of her clients were more interested in selfies than ecosystem preservation. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Yellowstone National Park," Sarah announced, her Chicago accent softened by years of speaking to diverse groups. "In just a few minutes, we'll be arriving at Mammoth Hot Springs, one of the park's most spectacular geothermal features. Please remember to stay on designated walkways, maintain at least 25 yards from all wildlife, and keep your voices down to avoid disturbing the animals that call this place home." Near the front of the bus, retired accountant William "Bill" Patterson adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and consulted the laminated itinerary his wife Margaret had organized with military precision. At 71, Bill had spent 43 years crunching numbers for a mid-sized accounting firm in Schaumburg, and this trip represented the first real vacation he and Margaret had taken since their honeymoon to Niagara Falls in 1974. Margaret, 68, sat beside him reviewing their digital camera settings for the 100th time, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the long bus ride from their hotel in Bozeman. "The camera's on the wrong setting again," Margaret whispered, frowning at the LCD display. "I don't understand why it keeps changing to that sports mode." Bill patted her knee reassuringly. "We'll figure it out, honey. There's plenty of time to get good pictures." 3 rows behind them, the Morrison family from Lincoln Park occupied an entire section of seats. Dr. James Morrison, a respected orthopedic surgeon at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, had organized this trip as a surprise for his wife Linda's 50th birthday. Linda taught 3rd grade at a prestigious private school in downtown Chicago, and their twin daughters, Jessica and Jennifer, were juniors at New Trier High School. At 17, the twins exhibited the casual indifference toward family activities that their parents hoped this trip might temporarily suspend. "Dad, how long until we can get off this bus?" Jessica complained, pulling out one earbud. "My phone's been dead for like an hour and there's no signal anyway." "That's the point, sweetheart," Dr. Morrison replied, though he'd been checking his own phone intermittently, concerned about a complicated surgery scheduled for the following week. "Sometimes it's good to disconnect from technology and reconnect with nature." Jennifer rolled her eyes. "You literally brought your laptop and that portable hotspot thing." Linda Morrison intervened before the familiar argument could escalate. "Let's just try to enjoy this, okay? When's the next time we'll all be together like this?" She didn't mention that Jessica would be leaving for college in less than 2 years, or that her marriage to James had been strained lately by his increasingly long hours at the hospital. Toward the middle of the bus, the Kowalski family presented a study in controlled chaos. Tom Kowalski, a foreman at a steel plant in Gary, Indiana, had saved for 3 years to afford this trip for his family. His wife, Rita, worked nights as a nurse at a local hospital, and their 3 children, Michael 14, Emma 12, and little Danny 7, had been counting down the days to this vacation for months. Tom's weathered hands gripped a well-worn guidebook, while Rita dozed against his shoulder, exhausted from working a double shift before their departure. "Are we going to see bears, Dad?" Danny asked for the 20th time, pressing his face against the window. "Real bears?" "Maybe, buddy," Tom replied, though he secretly hoped they wouldn't encounter any wildlife larger than a squirrel. Growing up in industrial northwest Indiana, Tom's experience with nature was limited to fishing trips to Lake Michigan and the occasional visit to the Indiana dunes. Michael, at 14, affected the bored demeanor typical of his age, but couldn't quite hide his excitement. "If we see a bear, I'm going to get a video for TikTok. It'll go viral for sure." Emma, sandwiched between her brothers, clutched a composition notebook where she'd been documenting every detail of their journey. An aspiring writer, she planned to turn this trip into a story for her 8th grade English class. Her careful cursive handwriting filled page after page with observations about landscapes, fellow passengers, and her own emotional responses to leaving Illinois for the first time. Near the back of the bus, the Chen family, no relation to their driver, represented the trip's most experienced outdoors enthusiasts. Robert Chen, a software engineer at a tech startup, had hiked portions of the Appalachian Trail during college and regularly took his family camping in Wisconsin's state parks. His wife Marie worked as a pediatric nurse practitioner, and their children, Kevin 16 and Amy 13, had been raised with a deep appreciation for wilderness preservation and outdoor recreation. "Look at those elk," Marie whispered, pointing to a small herd grazing near the roadside. "They're so much bigger than I expected." Robert lowered his professional-grade camera, already loaded with a high-capacity memory card. "The guidebook says bull elk can weigh up to 700 pounds during rutting season. These look like cows, though. See how they lack antlers." Kevin, despite his teenage reluctance to appear interested in family activities, found himself genuinely fascinated by the landscape. "Dad, what are those white areas on the mountainsides?" "Limestone formations," Robert replied. "Mammoth Hot Springs is essentially a massive limestone terrace created by thousands of years of geothermal activity. The hot water dissolves limestone deep underground, then deposits it as it cools near the surface." Amy scribbled notes in her journal, already planning the report she'd write for her advanced science class. Unlike many of her classmates, she genuinely enjoyed academic challenges and saw this trip as an opportunity to gather first-hand research about geological processes. Also seated in the bus's rear section were the Goldberg brothers, David and Michael, lifelong bachelors in their 50s who owned a successful plumbing business in Skokie. This trip represented their first vacation together since a disastrous fishing expedition to Wisconsin 15 years earlier. David, the older brother at 53, had recently survived a mild heart attack that prompted his doctor to recommend stress reduction and regular exercise. Michael, 51, had never married and lived alone in the same apartment he'd rented since the 1990s, spending most of his free time reading military history and watching documentaries about World War II. "I still think we should have gone to Gettysburg instead," Michael muttered, though without real conviction. "At least there I'd know what I was looking at." David chuckled. "Mike, you've been to every Civil War battlefield east of the Mississippi. It's time to try something different." "Nature photography isn't exactly my strong suit," Michael replied, hefting an expensive camera he'd purchased specifically for this trip. "I'm better with tanks and artillery pieces." The bus also carried several smaller groups and individual travelers who joined the tour through various Chicago area travel agencies. Among them were Helen and Dorothy Czarnecki, sisters in their 80s who'd immigrated from Poland as children and had never traveled west of Iowa. Seated near them were newlyweds Craig and Amanda Phillips, both teachers at Chicago public schools who'd used their spring break for a delayed honeymoon. Graduate student Maria Santos, pursuing her PhD in environmental science at the University of Illinois, had joined the tour as an affordable way to conduct field research for her dissertation on geothermal ecosystems. Also aboard were the Nguyen family, parents Lynn and Duke with their teenage son Peter, who'd moved to Chicago from Vietnam in the 1990s and owned a successful restaurant in Chinatown. This represented their first major vacation since establishing their business 12 years earlier. Retired postal worker Frank Kowalczyk, 74, had joined the tour alone after his wife's death the previous year, hoping travel might help him cope with his grief. Round out the passenger manifest were the Jackson family from the South Side, parents Denise and Anthony with their 3 young children, who'd won this trip through a church raffle. As the bus navigated the winding road toward Mammoth Hot Springs, driver Marcus Chen maintained constant radio contact with park rangers, a standard protocol for commercial tour groups. At 42, Marcus had been driving buses for nearly 2 decades, the last 8 exclusively for wilderness tour companies. Originally from Taiwan, he'd immigrated to the United States with his parents as a teenager and had developed a deep appreciation for America's national parks. His driving record was spotless, and his knowledge of Yellowstone's roads rivaled that of many park employees. Mammoth Hot Springs visitor area coming up in about 2 miles, Marcus announced over the intercom. We'll have approximately 90 minutes to explore the terraces before continuing to our hotel in Gardner. Please remember to bring water bottles and wear comfortable walking shoes. Sarah Rodriguez moved through the bus, checking on passengers and answering last-minute questions. Her experience had taught her to identify potential problems before they escalated. The family members who might wander off independently, the elderly passengers who might overestimate their physical capabilities, the children who might require constant supervision. She developed a mental checklist of safety concerns specific to Yellowstone. Thermal features that could cause severe burns, wildlife that might appear docile but could be extremely dangerous, high-altitude effects that could surprise visitors from sea level, and rapidly changing weather conditions that could turn pleasant afternoon into hypothermic emergency. "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said, stopping beside Margaret and Bill, "I noticed you brought a lot of camera equipment. The terraces have some uneven surfaces, so please be careful walking while taking pictures. I'd hate for anyone to slip on wet limestone." Margaret nodded eagerly. "Oh, we'll be very careful. Bill researched all the best photography spots online. We have a whole list of shots we want to get." Sarah smiled, though she'd learned to be cautious around overly enthusiastic amateur photographers. Some of her most challenging moments as a tour guide had involved retrieving tourists who'd ventured beyond safety barriers in pursuit of the perfect shot. "That's wonderful. Just remember that the terraces are still actively forming, so the ground can be unstable in some areas." Moving toward the back of the bus, Sarah checked on the families with children. "Mr. Kowalski, how are the kids doing?" Tom looked up from his guidebook. "Getting restless, but excited. Danny keeps asking about bears." "That's perfectly normal," Sarah replied. "We might see some wildlife, but I always tell families that the best bear viewing is usually early morning or late evening and from a safe distance. If we do encounter any large animals, the most important thing is to stay calm and follow my instructions immediately." She'd given similar speeches hundreds of times, though she'd never personally experienced a serious wildlife encounter during her 6 years of guiding. Her training included extensive coursework in bear safety, but like most guides, she'd developed a perhaps overly casual attitude toward the statistical improbability of dangerous animal encounters. Yellowstone hosted millions of visitors annually, and serious wildlife incidents remained remarkably rare. As the bus rounded a sweeping curve, passengers erupted in excited chatter as Mammoth Hot Springs came into view. The terraced limestone formations stretched up the hillside like frozen waterfalls, their surfaces gleaming white and pale yellow in the afternoon sunlight. Steam rose from dozens of hot springs, creating an otherworldly landscape that seemed transported from some alien planet. "Oh my goodness," Linda Morrison breathed, pressing her face to the window. "It's even more beautiful than the pictures." Dr. Morrison nodded, momentarily forgetting his surgical concerns. The geological processes that created this are absolutely incredible. Think about how many thousands of years this took to form. The twins, Jessica and Jennifer, temporarily abandoned their teenage indifference. "Can we actually walk on those?" Jessica asked. "Some areas," Sarah replied over the intercom. "There are boardwalks that let us get close to the active springs, and some of the older, cooler terraces have designated walking paths. But we must stay on marked trails at all times. The ground temperature in some areas can exceed 200 degrees Fahrenheit." As Marcus Chen guided the bus into the Mammoth Hot Springs parking area, Sarah mentally reviewed her standard routine for this stop. She'd done this dozens of times. Gather the group near the visitor center, distribute park maps, review safety guidelines one final time, then lead everyone up the boardwalk system that wound through the most spectacular terrace formations. The entire visit typically took about 90 minutes, allowing time for photographs, brief educational talks at several viewpoints, and a visit to the small gift shop. The parking area bustled with activity typical for a Friday afternoon in early May. Several other tour buses were already present, along with numerous private vehicles bearing license plates from across the country. National Park Service rangers, in their distinctive uniforms, moved through the crowd, answering questions and ensuring visitors stayed within designated areas. The scene represented everything Sarah loved about her job. People from diverse backgrounds united in their wonder at one of nature's most spectacular displays. What none of them could know was that approximately 2 miles northeast of the visitor center, a massive male grizzly bear designated as Bear Number 211 by park wildlife biologists was concluding a largely unsuccessful foraging session near Clematis Creek. At an estimated 475 pounds, Bear Number 211 was a mature adult who'd emerged from hibernation 3 weeks earlier than usual due to the unusually warm spring weather. His normal territory encompassed nearly 50 square miles of wilderness between Mammoth and Tower Junction, but recent construction activities related to road maintenance had disrupted several of his traditional feeding areas. Bear Number 211 had been radio collared 2 years earlier during a routine research operation, allowing wildlife biologists to track his movements via satellite telemetry. The data showed increasingly erratic behavior over the past month, including movement patterns that brought him closer to developed areas than previously recorded. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a wildlife biologist with the Yellowstone Center for Resources, and no relation to tour guide Sarah Rodriguez, had flagged Bear 211's recent GPS data as anomalous but not immediately concerning in her weekly report filed just 3 days earlier. The bear's hunger represented a more serious problem than park officials fully understood. Climate change had altered the timing of several key food sources that grizzlies depended on during their post-hibernation period. Whitebark pine nuts, normally available in abundance during late spring, had been devastated by mountain pine beetle infestations exacerbated by warmer winter temperatures. Early blooming wildflowers that provided crucial nutrition had emerged and died off weeks before Bear Number 211 ended his hibernation. Even earthworms, a surprisingly important food source for Yellowstone grizzlies, were less abundant due to soil conditions affected by the previous summer's severe drought. These factors combine to create what wildlife biologists call nutritional stress, a condition that can significantly alter bear behavior. Hungry bears take greater risks, venture into unfamiliar territories, and sometimes lose their natural wariness of humans. Bear number 211's recent GPS coordinates showed he'd been investigating areas near the Mammoth development where he'd never previously been recorded, drawn by the sense of human food waste and garbage that inevitably accumulated around high-traffic visitor areas. At 3:15 p.m., bear number 211 was approximately 1 mile from the Mammoth Hot Springs parking area, moving through dense lodgepole pine forest that provided excellent cover, while allowing him to monitor the sounds and smells emanating from the visitor complex. His exceptional hearing could distinguish individual human voices from hundreds of yards away, and his sense of smell, roughly 7 times more acute than a bloodhound's, provided detailed information about everything from packed lunches to perfume and shampoo. The bear had no malicious intent. He was simply following his instincts to investigate potential food sources during a period of extreme hunger. However, bear number 211's size, strength, and desperation created a combination that would prove catastrophic once circumstances brought him into contact with the busload of tourists from Chicago. As Marcus Chen carefully maneuvered the charter bus into a parking space near the visitor center, passengers began gathering their belongings in preparation for disembarking. The excitement level had reached its peak, with multiple conversations occurring simultaneously as family members pointed out features visible through the bus windows and made plans for their exploration of the hot springs. "Remember," Sarah announced, "we'll meet back at the bus at exactly 4:45 p.m. That gives everyone 90 minutes to explore. Please stay with your family groups, don't wander off the designated paths, and if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to find me. I'll be wearing this bright yellow jacket, so I should be easy to spot." She'd worn the same safety yellow windbreaker on every tour for 3 years, a practical choice that made her easily identifiable in crowds while providing visibility to park rangers and emergency personnel if needed. The jacket's multiple pockets contained everything from first aid supplies to emergency communication devices, though she'd never needed to use most of the equipment. Bill Patterson helped his wife Margaret down the bus stairs, both of them moving slowly due to arthritis that had worsened over the past few years. Margaret clutched her camera bag protectively, having packed thousands of dollars worth of photography equipment for this once-in-a-lifetime trip. "The air smells different here," Margaret observed, breathing deeply. "Like sulfur, but not unpleasant." "That's hydrogen sulfide from the hot springs," Dr. Morrison explained, overhearing her comment as he helped his own family gather their belongings. "It's completely natural and harmless in these concentrations." The Morrison twins, Jessica and Jennifer, had temporarily abandoned their sullen attitudes and were excitedly comparing the scene before them with photos they'd seen online. "Mom, can we go up to those terraces right away?" Jennifer asked. "We'll all stay together as a group," Linda Morrison replied, though she was equally eager to begin exploring. The limestone formations were even more spectacular in person than in any photograph, rising in stepped layers like some ancient amphitheater designed by giants. Tom Kowalski lifted 7-year-old Danny to his shoulders so the boy could get a better view of the terraces. "What do you think, buddy? Pretty amazing, right?" Danny's eyes were wide with wonder. "It looks like a giant staircase. Can we climb to the top?" "We'll see what the tour guide says," Tom replied, though he was privately concerned about navigating the uneven terrain while carrying his son. His wife Rita looked exhausted from her double shift the previous night, and their other children, Michael and Emma, were already restless from the long bus ride. Emma clutched her composition notebook, pen poised to capture every detail of their adventure. She'd already filled several pages during the bus ride, and the sight of Mammoth Hot Springs promised to provide material for weeks of writing projects. As the passengers finished disembarking, Sarah Rodriguez conducted a quick head count to ensure everyone had safely exited the bus. 43 people, ranging in age from 7-year-old Danny Kowalski to 74-year-old Frank Kowalczyk, stood clustered near the bus, their faces reflecting mixtures of excitement, wonder, and the slight disorientation that came with suddenly finding themselves in such an alien landscape. Marcus Chen secured the bus and checked his watch. "I'll be right here when you get back," he told Sarah. "Radio if you need anything." All commercial tour buses in Yellowstone were equipped with emergency radio systems that could reach park rangers, medical personnel, and law enforcement within seconds. The radios operated on multiple frequencies, ensuring communication even in areas where cell phone coverage was spotty or non-existent. Marcus had used his radio exactly twice during his 8 years of driving in Yellowstone. Once for a medical emergency when an elderly passenger experienced chest pains, and once during a mechanical breakdown that required a replacement bus. Sarah gathered her group near a large information board that displayed maps of the terrace system, along with safety warnings in multiple languages. The afternoon sun felt warm on their faces, though the elevation of over 6,000 feet meant temperatures could drop rapidly once the sun disappeared behind the surrounding mountains. "Before we begin our exploration," Sarah announced, raising her voice to address the entire group, "I want to review some important safety information specific to Mammoth Hot Springs. First, the terraces are formed by hot water that can exceed 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Please stay on designated walkways at all times. A single step off the path could result in severe burns that would require immediate helicopter evacuation to a hospital." She pointed toward the terraced formations, where boardwalks and marked trails wound through the most accessible areas. Second, we're at significant elevation here, so if you start feeling dizzy or short of breath, please let me know immediately. Third, while wildlife encounters are relatively rare in this area, we are in bear and elk country, so stay alert and never approach any animals we might see. The speech was identical to hundreds she'd given before, delivered with the practiced cadence of someone who knew every word by heart. What Sarah couldn't know was that her warning about wildlife encounters would prove tragically prescient within the next hour. "Any questions before we start walking?" she asked. Michael Kowalski, the 14-year-old, raised his hand. "What happens if we do see a bear?" Sarah smiled reassuringly. "That's a great question. If we encounter a bear, the most important thing is to stay calm and stick together. Bears usually want to avoid humans as much as we want to avoid them. We would back away slowly, make ourselves appear large by raising our arms, and speak in calm, quiet voices. But statistically, bear encounters are extremely rare in this area, especially during the afternoon hours." Her answer reflected standard National Park Service guidelines for bear encounters, guidelines that had been developed through decades of research and experience. However, those guidelines assumed normal bear behavior and circumstances, assumptions that wouldn't hold true for their encounter with bear number 211. As the group began moving toward the terrace system, Sarah fell into her familiar routine of combining geological education with safety awareness. "The terraces you see here represent over 10,000 years of continuous geothermal activity," she explained, as they walked along the paved pathway leading toward the boardwalks. "Hot water rises from deep underground, dissolving limestone in the bedrock. When the water reaches the surface and begins to cool, it deposits that dissolved limestone as travertine, gradually building these spectacular formations." The Patterson couple, Bill and Margaret, immediately began photographing everything in sight. Margaret's expensive camera clicked constantly as she documented their first few minutes at Mammoth Hot Springs, while Bill consulted their detailed itinerary and guidebook to identify specific formations they'd researched online. "That must be Pallet Spring," Bill said, pointing toward a colorful terrace about 50 yards ahead. The guidebook says it's one of the most photogenic spots in the entire park. Behind them, the Morrison family stayed together, though the twins were clearly eager to explore more independently. Dr. Morrison found himself genuinely fascinated by the geological processes Sarah described, temporarily forgetting his surgical concerns as he observed the intricate patterns of mineral deposition that had created these otherworldly landscapes. "Dad, look at that steam." Jessica Morrison pointed toward a particularly active spring where wisps of vapor rose into the clear afternoon air. "It really is hot enough to cook food, isn't it?" "Definitely," Dr. Morrison replied. "Some of these springs reach temperatures that would cause third-degree burns in seconds. That's why staying on the walkways is so important." The Chen family, Robert, Marie, Kevin, and Amy, moved as a tight unit, with Robert constantly snapping photographs while Marie and the children observed the intricate details of the terrace formations. As a pediatric nurse practitioner, Marie found herself automatically assessing potential safety hazards, though she was also genuinely awed by the natural beauty surrounding them. "The colors are incredible," Marie observed. "Why are some areas white while others are yellow or even orange?" Sarah overheard the question and included the entire group in her response. "The colors come from different minerals in the water and also from thermophilic bacteria, literally heat-loving bacteria that can survive in temperatures that would kill most organisms. The orange and yellow areas often indicate the presence of these bacteria colonies." As they progressed along the main boardwalk, the group naturally spread out over several hundred yards. Some families, like the Pattersons and Morrisons, moved slowly and methodically, stopping frequently for photographs and detailed examination of individual springs. Others, particularly those with young children, moved more quickly but with frequent direction changes as kids spotted interesting features and changed their minds about where they wanted to go next. Tom Kowalski found himself struggling to keep his family together while ensuring young Danny's safety. The 7-year-old was absolutely captivated by everything around him, constantly pointing at new discoveries and asking rapid-fire questions that his father struggled to answer. "Dad, why is that water so blue?" Danny asked, pointing toward a deep pool where mineral-rich water created an almost supernatural azure color. "I'm not sure, buddy," Tom replied honestly. "Maybe we can ask the tour guide when she catches up to us." Rita Kowalski walked slowly beside her husband, fighting exhaustion from her double shift at the hospital. She loved seeing her children's excitement, but the high altitude and bright sun were giving her a headache, and she found herself counting the minutes until they could return to the bus. Meanwhile, at the rear of the group, the elderly sisters Helen and Dorothy Charnecki moved at their own pace, supported by walking sticks they'd brought from Chicago. At 81 and 79 respectively, they'd surprised their families by insisting on taking this trip, determined to see America's natural wonders before their advancing age made such adventures impossible. "I never imagined anything like this existed," Dorothy said softly, gazing at the terraced formations that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. "It's like something from a fairy tale." Helen nodded, thinking of their childhood in a Polish immigrant neighborhood where the greatest natural wonder was the Chicago lakefront. "Mama and Papa never could have dreamed we'd see something like this." The group's various conversations and activities created the typical sounds of a tourist gathering. Excited voices, clicking cameras, children calling to parents, and the constant shuffle of footsteps on wooden boardwalks and paved pathways. These sounds carried clearly through the thin mountain air, traveling much farther than the visitors realized. At 3:32 p.m., bear number 211 was approximately 3/4 of a mile from the Mammoth Hot Springs visitor area, still moving slowly through the forest, but increasingly aware of human activity ahead. The combination of voices, mechanical sounds, and human scents provided him with detailed information about the size and composition of the tourist gathering. though his bear brain processed this data in terms of potential food opportunities rather than safety concerns. The bear had encountered humans before, but always at significant distances, and usually when he had easy escape routes available. His radio collar data showed that he'd occasionally paralleled hiking trails and even observed campers from concealed positions. But he'd never been in a situation where hunger overcame his natural caution around people. Bear number 211's condition had deteriorated significantly over the past week. Wildlife biologists would later estimate that he'd lost nearly 60 pounds since emerging from hibernation, bringing his body weight down to approximately 415 pounds. Still massive by most standards, but representing a dangerous level of nutritional stress for an animal of his size. His ribs were becoming visible beneath his thick fur, and his behavior showed increasing signs of desperation. As he moved through the forest, bear number 211 encountered the scent trail of a small group of elk that had passed through the area earlier that morning. Under normal circumstances, he might have followed this trail in hopes of finding a sick or injured animal, but the overwhelming smell of human food from the direction of Mammoth Hot Springs proved more compelling. His sensitive nose detected everything from sandwich meats to candy bars, along with the more subtle but equally attractive odors of cooking oils, spices, and processed foods that represented easy calories. The bear paused at the edge of a small clearing approximately half a mile from the visitor area, raising his massive head to sample the air currents. His hearing picked up the distinct sounds of human conversation, including the higher-pitched voices of children that often indicated families with food supplies. From his position, he could see glimpses of the mammoth development through the trees, buildings, vehicles, and the movement of people along the boardwalk systems. For several minutes, bear number 211 remained motionless, his primitive brain weighing instinctive caution against the powerful drive of hunger. The internal debate represented a crucial moment whose outcome would determine the fate of 43 unsuspecting tourists from Chicago. If the bear had turned away to continue foraging in the wilderness, the afternoon would have concluded with nothing more dramatic than spectacular photographs and satisfied visitors. Instead, his desperate need for calories tipped the balance toward investigation. At 3:35 p.m., bear number 211 began moving directly toward the Mammoth Hot Springs complex. Back at the terraces, Sarah Rodriguez's group had spread out along nearly a quarter-mile of boardwalks and paved trails, with family clusters exploring different areas according to their interests and physical capabilities. Sarah herself was positioned near the center of the dispersed group, answering questions and providing geological information while maintaining visual contact with as many visitors as possible. The afternoon had proceeded exactly as planned, with no safety incidents, mechanical problems, or behavioral issues that sometimes complicated group tours. Several passengers had commented that this was exceeding their expectations, and Sarah felt the quiet satisfaction that came with a successfully managed wilderness experience. "Sarah," called Margaret Patterson, waving from a viewpoint overlooking one of the most spectacular terrace formations, "could you take a picture of Bill and me together? We want to send it to our grandchildren." Sarah walked over to help with the photograph, temporarily losing sight of some group members who had continued along the boardwalk toward the upper terraces. This was a normal part of managing large groups. Tourists naturally spread out according to their interests and abilities, and experienced guides learned to maintain awareness of general group locations while providing individual assistance when requested. As she framed the shot of Bill and Margaret Patterson, Sarah was positioned with her back to the forest, focusing entirely on her camera duties and the enthusiastic commentary the elderly couple provided about their first visit to Yellowstone. The photograph would later be used by media outlets covering the story, showing the Pattersons' beaming faces with the beautiful terraced formations in the background, taken just minutes before their lives changed forever. "Perfect," Sarah said, handing the camera back to Margaret. "You two look like professional travel photographers. I'm sure your grandchildren will love seeing these pictures." Margaret beamed with pleasure. "This is already the best vacation we've ever taken. Bill was worried we might be too old to enjoy something like this, but I feel like I'm 20 years old again." Her words would be among the last normal conversation recorded that afternoon. At 3:41 p.m., as Sarah began walking back toward the main group, 7-year-old Danny Kowalski spotted something moving in the forest beyond the developed area. "Dad!" Danny called excitedly, still perched on his father's shoulders. "There's something big in the trees!" Tom Kowalski squinted in the direction his son was pointing, shading his eyes against the afternoon glare. "I don't see anything, buddy. Maybe it was just shadows." "No, it's moving. It's really big and brown." Several other visitors heard Danny's excited voice and began looking toward the forest edge, cameras ready in case of wildlife sighting. The possibility of seeing a bear or elk from a safe distance added excitement to their Yellowstone experience, and phones began emerging from pockets as people prepared to document whatever Danny might have spotted. Emma Kowalski, Danny's 12-year-old sister, followed her little brother's pointing finger and suddenly felt her stomach drop. Unlike the adults, whose angle of vision was partially blocked by intervening terrain, Emma had a clear line of sight to the forest edge, where a massive dark shape was moving purposefully through the trees. "Dad," Emma said quietly, her voice tight with fear. "I think Danny's right. There's definitely something there, and it's really, really big." Tom Kowalski lifted his eyes again, and this time he saw it too. A dark brown mass moving through the lodgepole pines, approximately 200 yards from the nearest tourists. For a moment, his brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing, the shape seeming too large to be real. "Jesus Christ," Tom breathed, then immediately apologized for the language in front of his children. "Rita, we need to find the tour guide right now." But Rita Kowalski had also spotted the bear, and her nursing training kicked in immediately. "Kids, move toward the boardwalk center, right now. Danny, get down from Daddy's shoulders. Michael, Emma, stay close together." Her voice carried enough authority that nearby tourists began turning to see what had caught the Kowalski family's attention. What they saw caused an immediate ripple effect of recognition and growing alarm as more people spotted the massive bear moving steadily toward the developed area. "Oh my God," someone said loudly, "that's a grizzly bear." Robert Chen, the software engineer and experienced outdoorsman, immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. "Marie, get the kids between us and the boardwalk center," he said quietly but firmly. "Kevin, Amy, move slowly toward that larger group of people near the information sign. Don't run, but don't waste time either." Marie Chen's pediatric nursing background made her acutely aware of how quickly situations could deteriorate when children were involved. "Robert, should we try to warn everyone?" "Yes, but carefully. We don't want to cause a panic." At that moment, bear number 211 emerged from the forest edge and became fully visible to everyone in the Mammoth Hot Springs area. Even at a distance of nearly 200 yards, his immense size was unmistakable. The bear paused at the tree line, rising briefly on his hind legs to get a better view of the human activity ahead, a behavior that made him appear even more enormous and threatening. The sight of a 400-pound grizzly bear standing upright and surveying a crowd of tourists created exactly the kind of panic that Robert Chen had hoped to avoid. Someone screamed. Later investigation would never determine who, and the sound seemed to trigger an immediate chain reaction of fear and confusion among the 43 visitors. Sarah Rodriguez, still helping the Patterson couple with their photography near the upper terraces, heard the scream and spun around to see what had caused the disturbance. Her years of training kicked in immediately as she spotted the bear, and she began moving quickly toward the center of her scattered group while calling out instructions. "Everyone remain calm," Sarah called, her voice projecting with the authority of someone trained in emergency management. "Move slowly toward the visitor center. Do not run. Stay together in groups. If you have children, keep them close." But the situation was already spiraling beyond the control of any single tour guide. The bear had dropped back to all fours and was now moving directly toward the tourist area, drawn by the sudden increase in noise and activity that his presence had created. What bear number 211 interpreted as potential feeding opportunity, the tourists correctly recognized as mortal danger. Dr. James Morrison, with his medical background, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "Linda, get the girls and move toward those larger buildings," he said, pointing toward the visitor center complex. "Stay calm, but don't hesitate." "What about you?" Linda Morrison asked, fear evident in her voice. "I'll help anyone who needs it. Then follow. Go now." The Morrison twins, Jessica and Jennifer, had temporarily forgotten their teenage indifference and moved close to their mother, their faces pale with fear. Like many suburban teenagers, their only knowledge of bears came from nature documentaries and movies, leaving them unprepared for the reality of encountering a massive predator in the wild. Throughout the tourist area, family groups were making split-second decisions about how to respond to the approaching bear. Some, like the Chen family, moved quickly but calmly toward areas that offered better protection or escape routes. Others, paralyzed by fear or unfamiliar with wildlife protocols, remained frozen in place, uncertain whether to flee or hide. The Goldberg brothers, David and Michael, found themselves near the outer edge of the tourist area with limited options for reaching safety. David's recent heart attack had left him in poor physical condition, while Michael's military history reading had provided him with tactical knowledge but little practical experience with dangerous wildlife. "Dave, can you make it to those buildings?" Michael asked, pointing toward the visitor center. "I'll try," David replied, though both brothers could see that the bear was moving faster than David's compromised cardiovascular system would allow him to travel. At 3:43 p.m., bear number 211 had covered half the distance between the forest edge and the outer perimeter of tourist activity. His approach was not a charge, not yet, but rather the purposeful movement of a large predator investigating potential food sources. However, his size and speed meant that investigative approach looked terrifyingly similar to attack from the perspective of the frightened tourists. Helena and Dorothy Zarnecki, the elderly Polish sisters, were positioned on a boardwalk section that offered no quick exit routes. At their age, and with their limited mobility, reaching safety before the bear arrived would be impossible. Helena, the older sister, made a decision that would be remembered as one of the day's most poignant moments. "Dorothy," Helena said softly, taking her sister's hand, "we've had good lives. Whatever happens, we've seen more beauty today than most people see in a lifetime." Dorothy squeezed her sister's hand. "I love you, Helena. I'm not afraid if we're together." Their quiet courage stood in stark contrast to the growing panic spreading through the tourist area as more people spotted the approaching bear and word spread among family groups. The situation was rapidly approaching a critical threshold where individual fear would combine into collective panic, creating exactly the kind of chaotic environment that could trigger predatory behavior in a stressed and hungry wild animal. Sarah Rodriguez reached the center of her group and began implementing emergency protocols she'd hoped never to use. "Everyone who can hear my voice, listen carefully," she shouted. "We have a bear approaching the area. Do not run unless I tell you to. Form groups around families with children, anyone with mobility issues. Identify yourself now so we can assist you. Her training emphasized the importance of maintaining group cohesion during wildlife encounters, but the reality of managing 43 frightened people spread across a quarter-mile area was proving far more challenging than any classroom scenario had suggested. Marcus Chen, monitoring the situation from the bus via radio communications with park rangers, had already called for emergency assistance. Dispatch, this is Tour Bus 47 at Mammoth Hot Springs. We have a large grizzly bear approaching a tourist group. Request immediate ranger response and possible medical standby. The radio crackled with the calm, professional voice of Park Service Dispatch. Tour Bus 47. We have rangers en route from Tower Junction and Gardner. ETA approximately 15 minutes. Can you provide more details on bear behavior and tourist locations? The bear appears to be moving directly toward the main terrace area where we have 43 passengers currently located, Marcus replied. Our guide is attempting to manage the group, but people are starting to panic. 15 minutes. Marcus did the math and felt his stomach clench with dread. At the rate the bear was moving, 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours. At 3:44 p.m., bear number 211 crossed an invisible threshold that wildlife biologists would later identify as the critical distance, the point at which a bear's presence near humans transitions from wildlife encounter to immediate danger. The bear was now less than 100 yards from the nearest tourists, close enough that his individual features were clearly visible. The distinctive shoulder hump that marked him as a grizzly, the massive head that could crush a human skull with a single bite, and the powerful limbs that could propel his 400-pound body at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour. The bear's behavior was still more curious than aggressive, but his sheer size and proximity had created a situation where any sudden movement by either the bear or the tourists could trigger catastrophe. Wildlife experts would later note that this represented a textbook example of how human-bear encounters could deteriorate, not through malicious intent on either side, but through the deadly combination of hunger, fear, and poor timing. Young Danny Kowalski, still the most observant member of his family despite being only 7 years old, noticed something that would prove crucial to understanding subsequent events. "Dad," he whispered urgently, "the bear keeps looking at people's bags and backpacks." Tom Kowalski followed his son's observation and realized Danny was correct. Bear number 211's attention seemed particularly focused on tourists carrying obvious food containers, backpacks and bags that might contain edible items. The bear's behavior suggested he was searching for easy calories rather than viewing humans as prey, but the distinction offered little comfort to people facing 400 pounds of muscle, claws, and teeth. The realization that food was attracting the bear prompted several tourists to make decisions that, while logical, would ultimately escalate the situation. Robert Chen quietly removed a protein bar from his backpack and tossed it as far as possible in the opposite direction from his family, hoping to distract the bear. Margaret Patterson, clutching her camera bag, began backing away from the main group, not realizing that her movement made her appear vulnerable to predatory investigation. Dr. Morrison, using his medical training to assess the situation clinically, recognized that they were approaching a point where scattered panic would make the situation infinitely more dangerous. "Sarah," he called to the tour guide, "should we try to group everyone in the visitor center building?" Sarah looked toward the building, mentally calculating distances and routes. "Yes, but we need to move as a coordinated group. Anyone who runs individually could trigger a chase response." It was sound advice based on established wildlife protocols, but implementing coordinated group movement with 43 frightened people of varying ages and physical capabilities would prove nearly impossible. As Sarah began attempting to organize an orderly withdrawal, events were already in motion that would make such plans irrelevant. At 3:45 p.m., bear number 211 was 70 yards from the nearest humans and beginning to show signs of increased agitation. The combination of multiple food scents, human voices, and his own desperate hunger was creating a psychological state that wildlife biologists term predatory arousal, a condition where a bear's normal caution around humans becomes secondary to the drive to secure calories. The bear's body language was changing in subtle but significant ways. His ears, which had been rotating to track various sounds, were now pinned back against his head. His massive head was lowered in a posture that experienced outdoorsmen would recognize as preparatory to either flight or attack. Most ominously, his pace was increasing as he approached the outer edge of the tourist area. "The bear's speeding up," observed Michael Goldberg, whose military history reading had given him an eye for tactical situations. "I think we're past the point where it might just wander away." His brother David nodded grimly. "Mike, I can't run fast enough to reach those buildings. If this goes bad, don't stay with me. Get yourself to safety." "We're not having that conversation," Michael replied firmly. "We're getting out of this together." Similar conversations were occurring throughout the tourist area as family members made rapid assessments of their options and capabilities. The elderly Czarnecki sisters had quietly positioned themselves near a sturdy handrail where they could maintain balance if sudden movement became necessary. The Nguyen family was moving slowly but steadily toward the visitor center, with parents Lynn and Duke flanking their teenage son Peter to ensure he didn't panic and run. Craig and Amanda Phillips, the newlywed teachers, found themselves caught between their instinct to flee and their professional training in crowd management. As Chicago public school teachers, they'd dealt with emergency situations before, though none involving apex predators. "Amanda, can you help that family with the little kids get organized?" Craig asked, pointing toward the Jackson family, who appeared paralyzed by fear and indecision. Amanda nodded and began moving toward them, her teacher's voice carrying calm authority, even as her heart pounded with terror. "Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm a teacher, and I think we should all stay together and move slowly toward that big building. Can everyone hold hands so we don't get separated?" Her intervention represented exactly the kind of coordinated response that might have helped manage the situation. But time was running out for organized solutions. Bear number 211 was now close enough that individual voices were clearly audible to him, and the sound of human conversation seemed to be increasing his agitation rather than deterring his approach. Maria Santos, the graduate student researching geothermal ecosystems, had more wilderness experience than most of the tourists and recognized the critical nature of their situation. "We need to make noise," she called to nearby groups. "Bears usually want to avoid confrontation. Everyone start talking loudly and clap your hands." Several people began following her advice, creating a cacophony of voices and clapping that was intended to convince the bear that retreat was his best option. However, bear number 211's response was not what wildlife protocols predicted. Instead of withdrawing, the noise seemed to focus his attention more intensely on the human gathering, possibly because his hunger-stressed brain was associating human activity with food availability. At 3:46 p.m., bear number 211 was 50 yards from the nearest tourists and showing unmistakable signs of agitation. His massive head swayed from side to side as he sampled scent currents, and his pace had increased to what could only be described as a purposeful approach rather than casual investigation. Sarah Rodriguez made a decision that would be debated by wildlife experts and emergency management professionals for years afterward. Recognizing that coordinated group movement was no longer feasible and that the bear's behavior was escalating toward potential attack, She activated her emergency whistle and shouted the instruction she'd hoped never to give. "Everyone move to the buildings now. Don't run, but move quickly. Stay in family groups." The instruction represented a calculated risk. Movement might trigger the bear's chase instinct, but remaining stationary was no longer safe either. As trained as Sarah was, she was facing a situation that exceeded standard protocols, requiring split-second decisions with potentially fatal consequences, regardless of which option she chose. The response to her instruction was immediate but chaotic. Some families, like the Chens and Morrisons, began moving quickly but in organized fashion toward the visitor center. Others, particularly those with elderly members or small children, found rapid movement impossible and instead clustered together on the boardwalks, hoping that group formation might deter the bear from approach. Tom Kowalski faced an agonizing decision. His wife Rita was exhausted and moving slowly. His 7-year-old son Danny couldn't move quickly on his own, and his other children needed guidance and protection. Attempting to move everyone simultaneously toward distant buildings seemed impossible, while staying in place put them at the mercy of an increasingly agitated predator. "Rita, take Danny and head for the visitor center," Tom decided. "Michael and Emma, go with your mum. I'll follow and make sure no one gets left behind." It was the kind of heroic decision that fathers make instinctively, placing his family's safety above his own. Rita Kowalski wanted to argue, but her nursing background told her that decisive action was more important than debate. She scooped up Danny and began moving as quickly as her exhaustion allowed, while 14-year-old Michael and 12-year-old Emma flanked her protectively. Throughout the tourist area, similar scenes were playing out as families made desperate decisions about how to respond to mortal danger. The situation had moved far beyond anything covered in standard tour guide training or park safety protocols, requiring ordinary people to make extraordinary choices with minimal information and no time for deliberation. Bear number 211, now 40 yards from the nearest humans, was exhibiting behavior that experienced wildlife biologists would later classify as predatory approach with heightened arousal. His massive body was moving with the fluid efficiency of an apex predator, and his attention was fixed specifically on the humans rather than scanning for escape routes or alternative food sources. The bear had selected his target. At 3:47 p.m., Margaret Patterson was positioned on an elevated boardwalk section that offered spectacular views of the upper terraces, but also left her isolated from larger groups of tourists. Her husband Bill was approximately 50 yards away, helping Helena and Dorothy Czarnecki navigate toward safer positions. Margaret's camera bag, filled with expensive photography equipment and packed snacks, hung prominently from her shoulder as she tried to decide which direction offered the safest route to rejoin other tourists. Bear number 211's exceptional vision identified Margaret as potentially the most vulnerable target, separated from group protection, carrying obvious food containers, and positioned on elevated terrain that limited her escape options. The bear's predatory instincts, sharpened by weeks of unsuccessful foraging and desperate hunger, focused entirely on the 78-year-old retired teacher from Schaumburg, Illinois. What happened next occurred with the terrifying speed that characterizes apex predator attacks. Bear number 211 broke into a full charge, covering the remaining 40 yards in less than 4 seconds. His massive body moved with shocking agility as he bounded across uneven terrain, knocked aside safety barriers, and focused on Margaret Patterson with the single-minded intensity of a predator securing prey. Margaret's scream cut through the afternoon air like a siren, immediately drawing the attention of everyone in the area and triggering panic responses that would dominate the next 10 minutes of chaos. She had perhaps 2 seconds to react before 400 pounds of muscle, claws, and teeth reached her position, Bill Patterson, seeing his wife of 49 years in mortal danger, began running toward her position despite his 71-year-old legs and arthritic joints. "Margaret!" he shouted, his voice breaking with terror and desperation. The bear reached Margaret's position on the boardwalk and reared up on his hind legs, towering nearly 8 feet above the terrified woman. For a moment that seemed frozen in time, predator and prey faced each other in a tableau that would be seared into the memory of every witness. Then bear number 211's massive paw swept down, striking Margaret in the chest and shoulder with force that sent her flying backward off the elevated boardwalk. The impact of a 400-pound grizzly bear's paw, backed by muscle density, evolved for breaking the necks of elk and bison, was catastrophic. Margaret Patterson's ribs shattered on impact, her left shoulder was dislocated, and the force of the blow launched her 6 feet through the air before she landed hard on limestone formations below the boardwalk. But bear number 211 was not finished. The taste of success and the proximity to human food containers triggered the feeding response that had been building for weeks. The bear dropped back to all fours and began pursuing Margaret, who was attempting to crawl away despite her massive injuries. What followed was a scene of horror that would traumatize witnesses for the rest of their lives. The bear grabbed Margaret by the leg with his massive jaws and began shaking her like a predator subduing prey. Her screams were audible across the entire Mammoth Hot Springs area, and the sound seemed to trigger panic responses in everyone who heard them. "Help her!" Bill Patterson screamed, still running toward his wife despite the obvious futility of his approach. "Somebody help her!" Dr. James Morrison, despite his medical training and knowledge of emergency procedures, found himself frozen in horror at the sight of injuries that were clearly beyond any field treatment. His surgeon's eye immediately assessed Margaret's condition as incompatible with survival. But his human heart couldn't accept that conclusion. The attack on Margaret Patterson was the spark that ignited complete chaos throughout the tourist area. Bear number 211's successful assault convinced other tourists that they were facing an actively hunting predator rather than a curious wild animal, and panic spread through the 43 visitors like wildfire. People began running in all directions, abandoning the coordinated group movement that Sarah Rodriguez had been attempting to organize. Parents grabbed children and fled toward any available cover. Elderly tourists collapsed from fear and exhaustion, and the orderly evacuation became a desperate rout that made everyone more vulnerable to predator attack. "Stay together!" Sarah shouted, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of screams, crying children, and panicked instructions that family members shouted to each other. Tom Kowalski, who had been ensuring his family's safe movement toward the visitor center, saw Margaret Patterson's attack and made a decision that epitomized both the heroism and tragedy of that afternoon. Instead of continuing toward safety with his own family, he began moving toward the bear, hoping to distract the animal from its assault on the elderly woman. "Hey! Hey, bear!" Tom shouted, waving his arms above his head. "Over here!" His intention was noble: draw the bear's attention away from Margaret and toward himself, hopefully giving her time to escape or receive help. But bear number 211's response was not what Tom had hoped. Rather than abandoning Margaret to pursue this new target, the bear seemed to recognize that multiple humans were available, and his predatory arousal escalated to new levels. Bear number 211 released Margaret Patterson, who collapsed motionless on the limestone formation, and began scanning the tourist area for additional opportunities. His massive head swiveled as he assessed multiple potential targets, his brain processing information with the deadly efficiency of an apex predator in full hunting mode. The bear's next target was Helena Czarnecki, the 81-year-old Polish immigrant who had been moving slowly toward the visitor center with the help of her sister Dorothy. Helena's mobility limitations had left her exposed when other tourists fled. and her position on the main boardwalk put her directly in the bear's path. Bear number 211 charged Helena with the same devastating speed he'd shown attacking Margaret, covering 25 yards in seconds. Helena had no chance to escape and no physical capability to defend herself. The bear's initial swipe knocked her down, and his massive jaws closed on her shoulder as she fell. Dorothy Czarnecki, seeing her sister under attack, made a decision that would become one of the day's most heartbreaking moments. Instead of fleeing to safety, the 79-year-old woman began hitting the bear with her walking stick, striking his massive head and shoulders in a desperate attempt to save Helena. "Leave her alone!" Dorothy screamed, continuing to strike the bear despite the obvious futility of her actions. "She's done nothing to you." Her courage was extraordinary, but her 90-pound frame and walking stick were no match for a 400-pound predator. Bear number 211, annoyed by the distraction, swatted Dorothy aside with a casual motion that sent her flying into a metal safety barrier. The impact broke several of her ribs and left her unconscious, but probably saved her life by removing her as a perceived threat. The bear returned his attention to Helena, who was crying softly, but no longer struggling. Her injuries were severe, deep lacerations on her shoulder and arm where the bear's claws had penetrated, possible internal injuries from the initial impact, and shock that was rapidly becoming life-threatening. As bear number 211 continued his assault on Helena Czarnecki, the panic in the tourist area reached critical mass. The sight of two elderly women being mauled by a massive predator convinced everyone that they were facing a killing spree rather than isolated attacks, and self-preservation instincts overrode all other considerations. Robert Chen, the experienced outdoorsman, grabbed his wife Marie and children Kevin and Amy and began running toward their parked car in the visitor lot. "Move! Move! Move!" he shouted. "Don't look back! Just get to the car." The Morrison family scattered despite their earlier cohesion. Dr. Morrison was torn between his medical duty to help injured victims and his parental responsibility to protect his own children. Linda Morrison made the decision for him, grabbing the twins and running toward the visitor center while shouting for him to follow. "James, there's nothing you can do for those women," Linda called over her shoulder. "We need to get the girls to safety." She was probably correct from a tactical standpoint. The injuries bear number 211 had inflicted were beyond field treatment, and approaching the bear to provide medical aid would likely result in additional casualties. But Dr. Morrison's medical training made abandoning injured patients psychologically devastating, even when the alternative was potentially sacrificing his own family. The Kowalski family had become separated during the initial panic, with Rita and the younger children continuing toward the visitor center while Tom moved toward the bear attacks. Michael Kowalski, the 14-year-old, found himself caught between following his mother and remaining with his father, unsure which choice represented safety or abandonment. "Dad!" Michael shouted. "What are you doing?" Tom Kowalski was asking himself the same question as he continued moving toward bear number 211, who was now mauling Helena Czarnecki while her sister lay unconscious nearby. Tom's plan, such as it was, involved making enough noise and commotion to convince the bear that easier food sources were available elsewhere, but he was beginning to realize that hunger-crazed predators don't respond to negotiation. "Get to the building with your mom," Tom called back to his son. "Make sure they're safe." It was probably the last normal conversation Tom Kowalski would have. Bear number 211, having inflicted massive damage on Helena Czarnecki, raised his blood-stained muzzle and fixed his attention on the approaching human who had been making challenging vocalizations. The bear's predatory brain identified Tom as the next threat requiring elimination. The charge that followed was even more devastating than the previous attacks. Bear number 211 had been building momentum and confidence with each successful assault, and his approach to Tom Kowalski demonstrated the full, horrifying potential of an apex predator in hunting mode. The bear covered 30 yards in less than 3 seconds, moving with fluid power that made his massive size seem almost graceful. Tom had perhaps 1 second to realize his mistake before 400 pounds of muscle and fury struck him chest high. The impact was equivalent to being hit by a small automobile, and Tom's body flew backwards 6 feet before striking a wooden bench with force that shattered the structure. But bear number 211 was far from finished with Tom Kowalski. The bear's successful attacks had triggered what wildlife biologists call feeding frenzy behavior, a psychological state where predators become fixated on continuing to attack until all perceived threats are eliminated or they become too exhausted to continue. The bear grabbed Tom by the torso with his massive jaws and began the head-shaking behavior that grizzlies use to break the necks of large prey. Tom's screams mixed with the horrifying sound of crushing bone and tearing flesh as the bear's teeth, designed to process tough vegetation and crack animal bones, did devastating damage to human tissue. Michael Kowalski, witnessing his father's mauling, experienced psychological trauma that would require years of therapy to address. The 14-year-old began running toward the attack, screaming incoherently, until Robert Chen tackled him and began dragging him toward the visitor center. "You can't help him," Robert shouted, restraining the struggling teenager. "Getting killed won't bring your dad back." Michael's struggles gradually weakened as shock set in, but his eyes remained fixed on the scene where bear number 211 continued mauling his father. The image would haunt his dreams for decades. At 3:52 p.m., just 5 minutes after the attacks began, bear number 211 was surrounded by 3 badly injured humans and had established complete dominance over the Mammoth Hot Springs area. Margaret Patterson lay motionless on limestone formations below the boardwalk, her injuries incompatible with survival. Helena Charnecki was unconscious and bleeding heavily from multiple lacerations, while her sister Dorothy remained unconscious from her impact with the safety barrier. Tom Kowalski was still alive, but suffering massive trauma that would require immediate helicopter evacuation to have any chance of survival. The bear, however, was not finished. The taste of blood and the adrenaline of successful hunting had triggered instincts evolved over thousands of years, and bear number 211 began scanning the tourist area for additional opportunities. His massive head swiveled as he assessed fleeing humans, and his body language suggested continued predatory arousal rather than satisfaction or retreat. The remaining tourists, many of whom had reached the vicinity of the visitor center, faced a terrifying realization. The bear was not leaving. Instead, bear number 211 began moving purposefully toward the largest concentration of remaining humans, apparently viewing the crowd as a rich feeding opportunity rather than a deterrent. "He's coming toward the building!" someone screamed, and panic reached new levels as people realized that reaching the visitor center had not ended their danger. Sarah Rodriguez, still attempting to maintain some semblance of group management, made rapid calculations about their options. The visitor center could accommodate most of the tourists, but its large windows and multiple entrances would not stop a determined bear. The parking area offered opportunities to reach vehicles, but would require crossing open ground where the bear could easily intercept fleeing tourists. "Everyone get inside the building!" Sarah shouted. "Lock the doors and stay away from windows!" But even as she gave the instruction, Sarah realized it might be inadequate. Bear number 211 was demonstrating behavior unlike anything in her training or experience. This was not a curious bear that could be deterred by human presence or loud noises. This was an active predator that had tasted success and was seeking additional opportunities. Bear number 211 approached the visitor center area where roughly 30 tourists had taken refuge, his massive body moving with the confidence of an apex predator that had eliminated resistance and established territorial dominance. The bear's attention was particularly drawn to the parking area, where several families were attempting to reach their vehicles. The Goldberg brothers, David and Michael, had been moving slowly toward the parking area when the attacks began, and David's poor cardiovascular condition had prevented them from reaching safety before bear number 211 began his approach toward the crowd. They were now trapped in open ground with limited options and a massive predator approaching their position. "Dave, we need to get behind one of those cars," Michael said, his military history knowledge suggesting that cover and concealment might offer some protection. David nodded, though both brothers understood that hiding behind vehicles would only work if the bear lost interest in pursuing humans. If bear number 211 remained in active predatory mode, sheet metal and glass would provide minimal protection from an animal capable of overturning small cars. The bear's approach toward the parking area was interrupted by a new development that would add another layer of tragedy to the afternoon's events. Craig Phillips, the newlywed teacher, had successfully helped his wife Amanda and several other tourists reach the visitor center, but he'd spotted elderly Frank Kowalczyk collapse near a picnic table approximately 50 yards from safety. Frank, the 74-year-old retired postal worker who joined the tour to cope with his wife's recent death, had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack during the panic following the initial bear attacks. He lay unconscious and clearly needed immediate medical attention, but reaching him would require crossing open ground that bear number 211 was now patrolling. Craig Phillips faced the same moral dilemma that had confronted Tom Kowalski and Dr. Morrison, the choice between personal safety and helping someone in desperate need. His teacher's instincts, developed through years of protecting students in Chicago's challenging school environment, ultimately overrode his survival instincts. "Amanda, stay in the building," Craig called to his wife. "That old man needs help." "Craig, no!" Amanda screamed. "Don't go out there!" But Craig was already moving toward Frank Kowalczyk's position, hoping to either provide emergency medical aid or drag the unconscious man to safety. His decision represented the kind of spontaneous heroism that emerges during disasters, when ordinary people risk their lives for strangers without calculating odds or considering alternatives. Bear number 211 spotted Craig's movement immediately and turned to assess this new opportunity. The bear had been moving generally toward the parking area, but the sight of an isolated human moving in open ground triggered his predatory focus. Craig Phillips had inadvertently made himself the bear's next target. The chase that followed was brief but horrifying. Craig realized his mistake within seconds of leaving cover, but by then, bear number 211 was already charging across the intervening distance. Craig abandoned his rescue attempt and began running toward the nearest vehicle, but his suburban teacher's conditioning was no match for a predator evolved for bringing down elk and bison. Bear number 211 caught Craig Phillips just as the teacher reached a parked SUV. The impact drove Craig into the vehicle's side panel with enough force to dent the metal, and the bear's initial swipe opened deep lacerations across Craig's back and shoulders. Craig's screams drew the attention of everyone in the visitor center, including his wife Amanda, who began pounding on the windows in helpless fury. "Let me out!" Amanda screamed at other tourists who were holding the doors closed. "I have to help him!" But opening the doors would have endangered everyone in the building, and several people restrained Amanda despite her desperate struggles. Through the windows, they could see bear number 211 mauling Craig Phillips with the same devastating efficiency he'd shown in previous attacks. The bear grabbed Craig by the leg and began dragging him away from the vehicle, apparently seeking an area where he could feed without interference. Craig's survival training from his teaching career had included active shooter protocols and emergency lockdown procedures, but nothing had prepared him for being treated as prey by a 400-pound predator. At 3:55 p.m., Bear number 211 had attacked 5 tourists and established complete control over the Mammoth Hot Springs area. Margaret Patterson was almost certainly dead from her massive injuries. Helena and Dorothy Czarnecki were unconscious and suffering from severe trauma. Tom Kowalski was barely alive with catastrophic injuries, and Craig Phillips was currently being mauled near the parking area while his wife watched helplessly from the visitor center. The remaining tourists, crowded into the building, faced the terrifying realization that they were trapped with limited escape routes and a predator that showed no signs of losing interest in human prey. Through the windows, they could see bear number 211 continuing to maul Craig Phillips, while occasionally scanning the area for additional opportunities. "How long until help arrives?" someone asked Sarah Rodriguez. Though everyone understood that traditional help, park rangers with bear spray and firearms, might arrive too late to save the people currently under attack. Sarah checked her radio and tried to maintain calm in her voice. "Rangers are en route, probably 10 minutes out. We need to stay together and stay inside until they arrive." 10 minutes. For the tourists crowded into the visitor center, 10 minutes seemed like an eternity while they listened to Craig Phillips's screams and watched bear number 211's relentless assault. For Craig himself, lying in the parking area with a 400-pound predator standing over him, 10 minutes represented an impossible span of time to survive. The bear's behavior was becoming even more erratic and dangerous. His successful attacks had provided little actual nutrition. Humans represent poor food sources compared to the fish, berries, and ungulates that normally comprise grizzly diets. But the taste of blood and the excitement of hunting had triggered instinctive behaviors that overrode rational assessment of the situation. Bear number 211 abandoned Craig Phillips, who lay motionless in a spreading pool of blood, and began investigating the exterior of the visitor center, where 30-plus tourists cowered inside. The building had large windows that provided excellent views of the terraces during normal circumstances. But now, those same windows allowed the bear to see potential prey, while providing the humans with terrifying views of their stalker. The bear approached the largest window and rose on his hind legs, pressing his massive paws against the glass while peering inside at the frightened humans. The sight was nightmare-inducing. 400 pounds of blood-stained predator, standing 8 feet tall, separated from 3 dozen terrified people by nothing more than plate glass and aluminum framing. "Is that glass strong enough to stop him?" whispered Maria Santos, the graduate student whose research on geothermal ecosystems had not included protocols for surviving grizzly bear attacks. Nobody answered because nobody knew. The visitor center had been designed to withstand weather and normal visitor traffic, not determined assault by apex predators. The windows were substantial, but bear number 211's size and strength made structural failure a real possibility. The bear seemed to understand that the humans were inside the building, and he began moving around the perimeter, testing different access points. His investigation was methodical and terrifying, the behavior of an intelligent predator assessing options for reaching trapped prey. "There's a back door," someone whispered. "What if he finds it?" Sarah Rodriguez was thinking the same thing. The visitor center had multiple entrances, and while the front doors were locked and barricaded, the building had not been designed as a fortress. If bear number 211 discovered and managed to open any of the entrances, the people inside would be trapped in confined space with an enraged predator. Outside in the parking area, Craig Phillips lay barely conscious, his teacher's training helping him remain motionless despite massive injuries. His survival instincts told him that movement might draw the bear's attention back to him, so he endured excruciating pain while trying to control his breathing and avoid making any sounds that might prove fatal. Amanda Phillips, pressed against the visitor center windows, watched her husband of 6 months lying in a pool of blood 30 yards away. Her teacher's training in trauma response warred with her desperate desire to help the man she loved, creating psychological stress that would require years of therapy to resolve. "Please," she whispered to the other tourists, "we have to help him. We can't just leave him there." But everyone understood that opening the doors would likely result in additional casualties without significantly improving Craig's chances of survival. His injuries appeared severe enough to require immediate helicopter evacuation, even if the bear had abandoned the area entirely. At 3:58 p.m., bear number 211 discovered the visitor center's loading dock entrance, a heavy door designed for deliveries but not specifically secured against wildlife intrusion. The bear began investigating this door with increasing interest, pushing against it with his massive body weight and testing the handle mechanism with his claws. Inside the building, tourists heard the bear's investigation and realized their sanctuary might be compromised. Parents pulled children into the interior rooms farthest from exterior walls, while adults began looking for improvised weapons or barricade materials. Dr. James Morrison, despite being separated from his medical equipment, began conducting rapid triage assessments of people inside the building. Several elderly tourists were showing signs of cardiac stress, and at least 2 children appeared to be entering psychological shock from witnessing the attacks. "Does anyone have medications for heart conditions?" Dr. Morrison asked quietly. "We may have medical emergencies developing inside here as well as outside." The realization that they were facing potential casualties from both bear attack and stress-related medical conditions added another layer of complexity to their survival situation. Even if bear number 211 eventually lost interest in human prey, the tourists trapped in the visitor center were developing their own life-threatening complications. The sound of splintering wood came from the loading dock area, indicating that bear number 211 was making progress in his attempts to breach the building. The bear's intelligence and determination were proving more formidable than anyone had anticipated, and the visitor center was beginning to seem more like a trap than a refuge. "We need to get ready to move," Sarah Rodriguez announced quietly. "If he gets inside, we'll need to exit through the front and reach vehicles in the parking area. Stay in family groups, help elderly and disabled members, and follow my lead." It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but remaining trapped in a confined space with a 400-pound predator offered even worse prospects for survival. At 4:01 p.m., the splintering sounds from the loading dock intensified as bear number 211's massive claws found purchase in the wooden doorframe. Inside the visitor center, 37 remaining tourists listened in growing terror as 400 pounds of determined predator worked methodically to breach their sanctuary. The bear's intelligence was becoming frighteningly apparent. Rather than randomly attacking the building, he was systematically testing structural weak points with the patience of an experienced hunter. Rita Kowalski, clutching her 7-year-old son Danny while trying to comfort 12-year-old Emma, found herself reliving her worst nightmares from her years as a trauma nurse. She'd seen the aftermath of industrial accidents, car crashes, and urban violence, but nothing had prepared her for watching her husband of 16 years being mauled by a wild animal while she cowered helplessly with their children. "Mom, is Dad going to be okay?" Danny whispered, his small voice barely audible above the sounds of the bear's assault on the building. Rita looked toward the windows, where Tom Kowalski lay motionless near the boardwalk area. His body twisted at angles that her medical training told her indicated massive internal trauma. Blood had pooled around his still form, and she hadn't seen any movement for several minutes. "I don't know, sweetheart," Rita replied honestly, pulling Danny closer. "The doctors will do everything they can when the ambulances get here." She didn't mention that Tom would need immediate helicopter evacuation to a level 1 trauma center to have any chance of survival, or that the bear's continued presence was preventing any rescue attempts. Her nursing background provided clinical understanding of his injuries, but her role as mother demanded that she maintain hope for her children's sake. Michael Kowalski, the 14-year-old who had witnessed his father's attack, sat in stunned silence against the far wall of the visitor center. Robert Chen, the software engineer who had tackled Michael to prevent him from running toward the bear, remained beside the traumatized teenager, unsure what comfort he could offer, but unwilling to abandon him to process the horror alone. "Your dad was very brave," Robert said quietly. "He was trying to help those other people." Michael nodded without speaking, his eyes fixed on nothing as his mind struggled to process images that would haunt him for decades. The casual suburban life he'd known, high school classes, TikTok videos, complaints about family vacations, had been shattered by 10 minutes of raw nature that revealed how fragile human civilization really was. The sound of splintering wood suddenly intensified, followed by a crash that indicated bear number 211 had successfully breached the loading dock door. Inside the visitor center, parents instinctively pulled children behind counters and displays, while adults grabbed anything that might serve as improvised weapons: folding chairs, fire extinguishers, hiking poles left by previous visitors. "He's inside the building," someone whispered, and the statement triggered a new wave of panic among the trapped tourists. Sarah Rodriguez, despite her fear, maintained her professional composure and began implementing the evacuation plan she'd outlined moments earlier. "Front door group, get ready to move on my signal. Stay low, move quickly toward the vehicles. If someone falls, help them, but don't stop moving." But her plan was complicated by the reality that several tourists were physically incapable of rapid movement. Frank Kowalczyk remained unconscious near the picnic table outside. Helena and Dorothy Czarnecki lay severely injured near the boardwalk area, and Craig Phillips was motionless in the parking lot. Any evacuation would mean abandoning people who might still be alive. Dr. Morrison faced the same moral dilemma that had confronted several others that afternoon: the choice between protecting his own family and attempting to help critically injured strangers. His medical oath demanded that he provide aid to anyone who needed it, but his paternal instincts insisted that his primary responsibility was to his wife Linda and daughters Jessica and Jennifer. "James, you can't help anyone if you're dead," Linda Morrison said quietly, reading the conflict in her husband's eyes. "The girls need their father alive." The twins, Jessica and Jennifer, had abandoned their typical teenage self-absorption and moved closer to their parents, fear making them suddenly aware of how much their family meant to them. The casual dismissal of parental authority that characterized their normal interactions had been replaced by desperate need for adult protection and guidance. From somewhere deeper in the visitor center came the unmistakable sound of a large animal moving through interior spaces. The click of claws on tile flooring, the scrape of fur against doorways, and the heavy breathing of a massive predator investigating unfamiliar territory. Bear number 211 had successfully entered the building and was now stalking through rooms filled with terrified humans. The bear's entry into the visitor center represented a nightmare scenario that exceeded all established protocols for human-wildlife encounters. Standard safety guidelines assumed that bears would avoid confined spaces where they might feel trapped. But bear number 211's hunger-driven behavior was proving that stressed predators don't follow normal behavioral patterns. Maria Santos, the graduate student whose research focused on geothermal ecosystems, realized that her academic knowledge of bear behavior was proving inadequate for survival. Her coursework had covered theoretical aspects of predator-prey relationships, but the reality of being prey was beyond anything covered in university classrooms. "Can bears see in the dark?" whispered Amy Chen, the 13-year-old daughter of Robert and Marie Chen. "Better than we can," Maria replied honestly. but they rely more on smell and hearing than sight. The information was accurate but hardly comforting to people trapped in a building with a 400-pound predator that possessed sensory capabilities far superior to their own. Bear number 211's nose could detect human scents from hundreds of yards away. His hearing could distinguish individual heartbeats, and his low-light vision was evolved for hunting in dense forests. The sounds of the bear's investigation grew closer to the main visitor area where most of the tourists were hiding. Somewhere in the building's interior, bear number 211 was methodically searching rooms and corridors, following scent trails that would inevitably lead him to the largest concentration of potential prey. "We need to leave now," Sarah Rodriguez announced quietly but firmly. "Front exit, stay together, move toward vehicles. Anyone who can't move quickly, identify yourself now so we can provide assistance." Several elderly tourists raised their hands, including the Goldberg brothers David and Michael, who were positioned near the windows. David's recent heart attack had left him with limited mobility, while Michael was unwilling to abandon his brother despite the obvious danger of remaining together. "Dave, you need to go without me," Michael said. "I'll slow everyone down." "We're not having that conversation again," David replied. "We came here together. We're leaving together." Similar conversations were occurring throughout the visitor center as family groups and strangers faced decisions about mutual aid versus individual survival. The social bonds that normally governed human behavior were being tested by circumstances that reduced existence to its most primitive elements. The newlywed Amanda Phillips pressed against the windows, still watching her husband, Craig's motionless form, in the parking lot. Craig had not moved for several minutes, and the pool of blood around his body had expanded significantly. But Amanda refused to accept that he might be beyond help. "I can't leave him," she whispered to herself. "I can't just drive away and leave him here." But everyone understood that approaching Craig's position would require crossing open ground where the bear could easily intercept rescue attempts. Even if Craig was still alive, reaching him would likely result in additional casualties without significantly improving his chances of survival. At 4:04 p.m., Bear number 211's investigation of the visitor center interior was becoming more focused and purposeful. The bear had initially moved through the building randomly, investigating offices and storage areas, but now his behavior indicated he was following specific scent trails toward the main visitor area. The sound of the approaching predator created a psychological pressure that was breaking down the tourists' ability to think rationally. Several people began hyperventilating, children started crying despite their parents' attempts to keep them quiet, and the stress of prolonged terror was causing some adults to make increasingly desperate suggestions. "Maybe we should just run in different directions," suggested one of the Jackson family members. "He can't catch all of us." "That's exactly what we shouldn't do," Sarah Rodriguez replied firmly. "Scattered running triggers chase responses. We stay together and move as a coordinated group." Her professional training emphasized the importance of maintaining group cohesion during wildlife encounters, but the reality of managing 36 terrified people in a confined space with a predator was testing the limits of any protocol. Every decision carried potentially fatal consequences, and there were no good options available. The bear's heavy footsteps were now clearly audible from the corridor leading to the main visitor area. Bear number 211 had navigated the building's interior and was approaching the room where most of the tourists were hiding. Through gaps in the interior doors, people could glimpse movement and shadows that indicated a massive animal was just yards away from their position. Robert Chen positioned himself between his family and the interior corridor, holding a folding chair as an improvised weapon despite understanding its inadequacy against a 400-pound predator. His software engineering background provided no relevant skills for the situation, but his parental instincts demanded that he make some attempt to protect his wife Marie and children Kevin and Amy. "Dad, what are you going to do with that chair?" 16-year-old Kevin asked quietly. "Whatever I can," Robert replied, though both father and son understood the futility of the gesture. Marie Chen, drawing on her experience as a pediatric nurse practitioner, was conducting rapid assessments of the children in their vicinity, identifying those who might need immediate support if the situation deteriorated further. Several young ones were showing signs of psychological shock that could prove as dangerous as physical injuries if not addressed promptly. The bear's approach suddenly stopped, and an ominous silence fell over the visitor center. Bear number 211 had reached the entrance to the main visitor area and was now assessing the situation, his massive head perhaps visible through the doorway as he evaluated dozens of potential targets clustered in a confined space. For several seconds, predator and prey remained motionless in a standoff that would determine whether the afternoon's tragedy expanded into something even more catastrophic. Bear number 211's brain processed information about human numbers, escape routes, and feeding opportunities, while 36 people held their breath and prayed that his hunger might be satisfied by previous attacks. The silence was broken by 7-year-old Danny Kowalski, whose stress and confusion overcame his mother's attempts to keep him quiet. "Mommy, I want to go home," Danny said in a voice that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. "I want Daddy to take us home." His innocent words triggered the final phase of the encounter. Bear number 211's acute hearing identified the child's voice as indicating vulnerable prey, and his predatory instincts focused on the small human whose vocalizations marked him as an easy target. The bear entered the main visitor area. What followed was chaos that defied rational description. Bear number 211's massive form filled the doorway as he surveyed the room full of terrified humans, his blood-stained muzzle and predatory posture leaving no doubt about his intentions. The sight of a 400-pound grizzly bear standing in the same room triggered panic responses that overrode all attempts at coordinated evacuation. People scattered in every direction, abandoning Sarah Rodriguez's careful plans for group movement. Parents grabbed children and ran toward any exit they could identify. Elderly tourists collapsed from terror and physical stress, and the orderly evacuation became a desperate stampede that made everyone more vulnerable to predator attack. "Front exit!" Sarah shouted over the chaos, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of screams, crying children, and panicked instructions that people shouted to family members. Bear number 211's presence in the visitor center triggered predatory behaviors that wildlife biologists call surplus killing, the phenomenon where predators attack far more prey than they can consume, driven by instinctive responses to abundant opportunities rather than nutritional needs. The bear's massive head swiveled as he assessed multiple targets, his brain selecting victims based on vulnerability and accessibility. His first target was Helen Chen, Kevin and Amy's 13-year-old sister, who had become separated from her family in the initial panic. The bear's charge across the visitor center covered 20 feet in less than 2 seconds, and his massive paw struck the teenager with force that sent her flying into a display case filled with geological specimens. Amy's impact with the glass case created sounds that would haunt every survivor. The crash of breaking glass, the thud of a human body striking solid surfaces, and the immediate screams of family members who witnessed the attack. Robert and Marie Chen began moving toward their daughter, despite the obvious danger, parental instincts overriding survival calculations. "Amai!" Marie screamed, her nurse's training warring with maternal panic as she assessed her daughter's condition from across the room. "Amy, can you hear me?" But bear number 211 was not finished with his assault. The successful attack on Amy Chen had intensified his predatory arousal, and he immediately began searching for additional targets among the scattered tourists. His massive form moved through the visitor center with shocking agility, knocking aside furniture and displays as he pursued fleeing humans. The bear's next victim was David Goldberg, the 53-year-old plumbing contractor whose recent heart attack had left him unable to move quickly enough to escape. David had been attempting to reach the front exit when bear number 211's charge intercepted his path, and the collision was devastating. The bear's initial impact drove David to the floor with enough force to crack ribs, and his massive jaws closed on David's shoulder as the man attempted to crawl away. David's screams mixed with the sounds of crushing bone as bear number 211's teeth evolved for processing tough vegetation and breaking animal bones, inflicted catastrophic damage on human tissue. Michael Goldberg, seeing his brother under attack, faced the same moral dilemma that had confronted several others that afternoon. His military history reading had provided theoretical knowledge about combat situations, but the reality of facing a 400-pound predator with improvised weapons was beyond anything covered in books about World War II. "Get away from him!" Michael shouted, striking the bear's massive head with a metal trash can he'd grabbed as an improvised weapon. The impacts were largely ineffective against bear number 211's thick skull and dense fur, but they succeeded in drawing the bear's attention away from David. Bear number 211 released David Goldberg and turned to address this new challenger, his massive head lowering in the posture that experienced outdoorsmen would recognize as preparatory to attack. Michael Goldberg had perhaps 2 seconds to realize that his heroic gesture was likely to prove fatal before 400 pounds of muscle and fury focused entirely on him. The bear's assault on Michael was even more devastating than previous attacks. Bear number 211 reared up on his hind legs and brought both massive paws down on Michael's shoulders, driving him to the floor with force that shattered his collarbone and several ribs. The bear's claws, each over 4 inches long and designed for digging and climbing, opened deep lacerations across Michael's back and chest. Michael's survival training from his reading about military combat had included information about treating wounds and surviving behind enemy lines. But nothing had prepared him for being mauled by an apex predator in a confined space. His consciousness began fading as shock and blood loss took their toll, though he remained dimly aware of his brother David's voice calling his name. The attacks on the Goldberg brothers were witnessed by everyone still in the visitor center, and the sight of 2 middle-aged men being systematically mauled by a massive predator convinced the remaining tourists that they were facing a killing machine rather than a hungry wild animal seeking food. Dr. James Morrison, despite his medical training and ethical obligations to help injured patients, found himself paralyzed by the scope of the casualties developing around him. Amy Chen lay unconscious among broken glass. David and Michael Goldberg were both suffering from massive trauma that required immediate surgical intervention, and several other tourists were showing signs of cardiac distress from prolonged terror. "There's nothing I can do for them without equipment," Dr. Morrison said to his wife Linda, though the admission felt like professional and moral failure. "If I approach those injuries, I'll just become another casualty." Linda Morrison understood her husband's anguish, but her primary concern was protecting their daughters, Jessica and Jennifer, who were witnessing violence that would require years of therapy to process. The twins had temporarily abandoned their teenage independence and were clinging to their parents with desperate need for protection. "Mom, I want to go home," Jennifer whispered, echoing young Danny Kowalski's earlier plea. "I want this to stop." But there was no way to make it stop. Bear number 211 continued his assault on the visitor center, moving from victim to victim with the methodical efficiency of an apex predator processing abundant prey. His attacks were not random violence, but rather the systematic behavior of a hunter that had identified a rich feeding opportunity. The bear's next target was Maria Santos, the graduate student whose research on geothermal ecosystems had brought her to Yellowstone. Maria had been attempting to reach the front exit when bear number 211's attention focused on her, and her academic knowledge of predator behavior provided no practical assistance for escaping a 400-pound grizzly in a confined space. Maria's attempt to evade the bear by climbing over furniture and displays demonstrated human ingenuity in crisis situations, but bear number 211's size, strength, and agility made such evasion attempts largely futile. The bear knocked aside chairs and tables as he pursued her, his massive claws finding purchase on any surface that might help him reach his prey. The chase ended when Maria became trapped in a corner of the visitor center with no remaining escape routes. Bear number 211 approached her with the confidence of a predator that had cornered vulnerable prey, his massive head lowering as he prepared to deliver the killing bite that would end her struggles. "Please," Maria whispered, though she understood that appeals to mercy were meaningless to a wild animal operating on instinctive behaviors. "Please don't." The bear's assault on Maria Santos was interrupted by an unexpected development that would change the trajectory of the entire encounter. At 4:08 p.m., the first National Park Service ranger arrived at Mammoth Hot Springs, responding to Marcus Chen's emergency radio call placed nearly 30 minutes earlier. Ranger Patricia Hawkins, a 28-year-old law enforcement officer with 6 years of experience in Yellowstone, had been patrolling the Tower Junction area when the emergency call came through dispatch. Her initial response had been delayed by distance and winding mountain roads, but she arrived at the scene with standard equipment for wildlife encounters: bear spray, a high-powered rifle, and training in crisis management. What Ranger Hawkins encountered exceeded anything in her experience or training. The Mammoth Hot Springs area looked like a battlefield, with multiple injured tourists scattered across the terraces and parking areas, blood staining the limestone formations, and clear evidence of ongoing predator attack. Her radio crackled with updates from other rangers en route, but she was alone with a situation that required immediate action. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Hawkins at Mammoth Hot Springs," she radioed while rapidly assessing the scene. "I have multiple casualties from bear attack, with the bear still actively engaged. Request immediate medical helicopter and additional ranger response. I'm going to attempt intervention." Patricia Hawkins had trained extensively for wildlife encounters, but her protocols assumed single victims and bears that could be deterred by standard methods. The scope of casualties and the evidence of prolonged predatory behavior indicated a situation that exceeded normal response procedures. Through the visitor center windows, Ranger Hawkins could see bear number 211 in the process of attacking Maria Santos, while dozens of other tourists cowered throughout the building. The bear's behavior was unlike anything described in her training. Rather than a defensive animal that could be scared away, this appeared to be an active predator engaged in surplus killing behavior. Patricia Hawkins made a decision that would be analyzed by wildlife management professionals for years afterward. Instead of attempting to enter the visitor center, where her presence might escalate the bear's aggression in a confined space, she decided to create a distraction that might draw bear number 211 outside, where she could engage him with greater tactical advantage. "Hey, bear!" Ranger Hawkins shouted at maximum volume while activating her emergency whistle. "Over here! Come on!" Her intention was to draw the bear's attention away from the tourists and toward herself, where she could attempt to deter him with bear spray or, if necessary, use lethal force to end the attacks. The plan represented standard protocol for protecting civilians from dangerous wildlife, though the circumstances were far from standard. Bear number 211's response to Ranger Hawkins's challenge was immediate and decisive. The bear abandoned his assault on Maria Santos and turned toward the source of the new vocalizations, his massive head swiveling as he identified this latest challenger. The sight of a uniformed ranger shouting and making aggressive gestures triggered the bear's territorial response, overriding his predatory focus on the tourists. The bear began moving toward the visitor center exit, his massive form filling the doorway as he assessed this new threat. Ranger Hawkins represented a different type of challenge than the fleeing tourists, an individual making aggressive displays rather than showing submission or fear. Bear number 211's brain processed this information and concluded that territorial dominance needed to be established before feeding could continue. "That's right, come on out here," Patricia Hawkins muttered, readying her bear spray while maintaining distance that would allow for tactical response. "Let's settle this outside." Her plan was tactically sound: draw the bear into open ground where her equipment and training would provide maximum advantage while protecting the civilians trapped inside the building. However, the plan assumed that bear number 211 would respond like a normal bear encountering human authority, rather than a predator that had already successfully attacked multiple humans. As bear number 211 emerged from the visitor center, the full scope of his size and the evidence of his attacks became apparent to Ranger Hawkins. The bear was significantly larger than average for male grizzlies in the Yellowstone ecosystem, his massive frame indicating an animal in the upper range of the species' physical capabilities. More ominously, his muzzle and front paws were stained with blood from his multiple attacks, and his behavior showed none of the caution that normally characterized bear encounters with armed humans. "Jesus," Patricia Hawkins whispered, realizing that she was facing an animal whose behavior exceeded her training and experience. "Dispatch, the bear is approximately 450 pounds, showing extreme aggressive behavior and has blood evidence from multiple attacks. I may need to use lethal force." The radio crackled with the voice of Chief Ranger Williams, who was en route with additional personnel and equipment. "Ranger Hawkins, do whatever is necessary to protect civilian lives. Additional units are 8 minutes out." 8 minutes. Patricia Hawkins calculated distances and tactical options while bear number 211 continued his approach, moving with the confident gait of an apex predator that had established dominance over the territory. The bear's attention was now focused entirely on her, temporarily relieving pressure on the tourists inside the visitor center, but creating life-or-death confrontation that would test every aspect of her training. At 4:10 p.m., Ranger Patricia Hawkins and bear number 211 faced each other across 30 yards of open ground near the Mammoth Hot Springs Visitor Center. Behind them, the evidence of the afternoon's tragedy was scattered across the terraces and parking areas. Margaret Patterson's body near the boardwalk, Tom Kowalski motionless beside a shattered bench, Craig Phillips unconscious in a pool of blood, and the Zarnecki sisters lying where they had fallen. Inside the visitor center, survivors tended to new casualties while watching through windows as their potential salvation confronted 400 pounds of determined predator. The confrontation that followed would be remembered as one of the most harrowing wildlife encounters in National Park Service history, a battle between human authority and wild nature that demonstrated both the courage of individual rangers and the limitations of standard protocols when facing extraordinary circumstances. Bear number 211 approached Ranger Hawkins with the methodical pace of a predator that had already tasted success and was confident in its abilities. The bear's massive head was lowered in an aggressive posture, his ears pinned back against his skull, and his movements showed none of the hesitation that normally characterized bear encounters with armed humans. Patricia Hawkins waited until the bear reached the optimal range for her bear spray, approximately 20 feet, before deploying her first line of defense. The orange spray created a wide cloud of oleoresin capsicum that should have caused immediate pain and disorientation, forcing the bear to retreat and reassess the threat. Bear number 211's response was not what protocols predicted. Instead of retreating from the painful spray, the bear charged directly through the cloud with the momentum of desperation and hunger that had been building for weeks. His massive body absorbed the chemical irritant while continuing his assault, demonstrating the kind of determination that made grizzly bears one of North America's most formidable predators. "Shit," Patricia Hawkins breathed, realizing that her primary deterrent had failed and that lethal force was now her only option for survival. The ranger's rifle was a .308 Winchester loaded with ammunition specifically designed for dangerous wildlife encounters. Her training had emphasized shot placement over raw power, since even large caliber rounds could fail to stop a charging bear if they didn't strike vital areas. Patricia had perhaps 2 seconds to acquire her target and deliver accurate fire before 400 pounds of muscle and fury reached her position. Her first shot struck bear number 211 in the chest, penetrating deep into vital organs, but failing to immediately stop the bear's charge. Grizzly bears possess tremendous physical resilience, and adrenaline can allow even mortally wounded animals to continue attacking for several minutes before succumbing to their injuries. Bear number 211 reached Ranger Hawkins' position and reared up on his hind legs, towering nearly 8 feet above the human who had challenged his dominance. His massive paws swept down with crushing force, striking Patricia in the shoulder and chest with impacts that sent her flying backward into a parked vehicle. The ranger's body armor absorbed some of the impact, but the bear's claws penetrated the protective fabric and opened deep lacerations across her torso. Patricia's rifle was knocked from her hands by the force of the blow, leaving her effectively disarmed against an opponent that retained full combat capability despite suffering what should have been a fatal wound. Bear number 211 dropped back to all fours and approached the fallen ranger with the confidence of a predator finishing wounded prey. Patricia Hawkins, despite her injuries, attempted to reach her sidearm, a .40 caliber pistol that represented her backup weapon for close quarters encounters. Inside the visitor center, tourists watched in horror as their potential rescuer was systematically mauled by the same predator that had terrorized them for the past 30 minutes. The sight of a trained ranger being overpowered by bear number 211 convinced many survivors that no human authority was sufficient to end their nightmare. "She's not going to make it," someone whispered, voicing what everyone was thinking as they watched Ranger Hawkins struggle to defend herself against an opponent whose size and strength made the outcome inevitable. But Patricia Hawkins was not finished. Despite massive injuries from the bear's claws and the impact with the vehicle, she managed to draw her sidearm and began firing at point-blank range into bear number 211's torso. The .40 caliber rounds lacked the power of her rifle, but delivered at contact distance, they began to have cumulative effect on the bear's massive body. Bear number 211's assault on Ranger Hawkins was interrupted by the arrival of additional help that would finally tip the balance in favor of human survival. At 4:12 p.m., Chief Ranger David Williams arrived at Mammoth Hot Springs with 2 additional rangers and equipment that included military-grade weapons designed specifically for dangerous wildlife encounters. Chief Ranger Williams had 30 years of experience in Yellowstone and had responded to dozens of wildlife incidents, but nothing in his background had prepared him for the scene he encountered. The evidence of prolonged predator attack was scattered across the entire area, with multiple casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation and a massive bear that was actively mauling one of his rangers. "All units, engage the bear immediately," Chief Williams commanded over his radio. "Use whatever force is necessary to stop the attack." The concentrated gunfire from 3 experienced rangers using high-powered rifles with proper ammunition finally achieved what individual efforts had been unable to accomplish. Bear number 211's massive body absorbed multiple rounds before his nervous system succumbed to the cumulative damage, and his assault on Ranger Hawkins gradually weakened as his life functions began to fail. At 4:14 p.m., bear number 211 collapsed beside Patricia Hawkins's motionless form, his massive body finally succumbing to injuries that would have killed most animals within minutes. The 400-pound grizzly that had terrorized 43 tourists and challenged human authority in the heart of America's oldest national park was finally still. Though the aftermath of his rampage would continue for hours and its psychological effects would last for years, the immediate priority shifted to medical triage and evacuation of the numerous casualties scattered across the Mammoth Hot Springs area. Chief Ranger Williams began coordinating with medical helicopters that were already en route, while his remaining personnel secured the scene and began assessing the condition of survivors. Medical helicopter, this is Chief Ranger Williams at Mammoth Hot Springs. He radioed to the incoming flight crews. We have multiple trauma cases requiring immediate evacuation. Some injuries are incompatible with survival. Others need emergency surgery within the hour. Request multiple aircraft and Level 1 Trauma Center alerts. The medical response to the Mammoth Hot Springs bear attack would involve 4 helicopters, dozens of emergency personnel, and coordination with trauma centers across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. The scope of casualties exceeded the immediate capacity of any single hospital, requiring patient distribution across multiple facilities based on injury severity and available resources. Inside the visitor center, survivors began emerging to assess the aftermath of their nightmare. The building's interior showed evidence of the bear's assault: overturned furniture, broken displays, bloodstains on floors and walls, and broken glass where victims had been thrown into fixtures. The psychological impact on survivors would prove as significant as the physical injuries, requiring counseling and support services that would continue for years. Dr. James Morrison, despite his own trauma from witnessing the attacks, immediately began providing emergency medical care to the most critically injured survivors. His surgical training proved invaluable in stabilizing patients for helicopter evacuation, though several victims had injuries that exceeded field treatment capabilities. Amy Chen needs immediate neurosurgical evaluation, Dr. Morrison reported to incoming medical personnel. Possible traumatic brain injury from impact with glass case. David and Michael Goldberg both have massive lacerations and possible internal bleeding, several others showing signs of shock and cardiac distress. The triage decisions required by the situation were among the most difficult in emergency medicine, determining which patients had realistic chances of survival and allocating limited resources accordingly. Margaret Patterson was clearly beyond help, having succumbed to massive trauma during the initial attack. Tom Kowalski and Craig Phillips were barely alive and would require immediate surgical intervention to have any chance of survival. As medical helicopters began landing in the Mammoth Hot Springs parking area, survivors faced the reality that their nightmare was far from over. The physical injuries would require months or years of treatment. The psychological trauma would affect everyone who witnessed the attacks, and the legal and administrative aftermath would continue long after the last patient was evacuated to hospital care. Rita Kowalski faced the possibility that her husband of 16 years might not survive his injuries, while simultaneously trying to provide emotional support for children who had watched their father being mauled by a wild animal. Her nursing background provided clinical understanding of Tom's condition, but her role as wife and mother demanded that she maintain hope despite overwhelming medical evidence. "Is Daddy going to come home with us?" 7-year-old Danny asked, as medical personnel worked frantically to stabilize his father for helicopter evacuation. Rita looked at Tom's still form, his body connected to multiple monitoring devices and IV lines as flight medics prepared him for transport to a Level 1 trauma center in Salt Lake City. The extent of his injuries, massive soft tissue damage, probable internal bleeding, possible spinal trauma, suggested that even survival would mean permanent disability and months of reconstructive surgery. "The doctors are going to take very good care of him," Rita replied, choosing her words carefully. "He's going to a special hospital where they help people who are hurt really badly." It was the kind of answer that parents give when the truth is too terrible for children to process, though Rita understood that the questions would continue and eventually require more complete honesty about the permanent changes their family had suffered. The helicopter evacuation of casualties continued throughout the late afternoon and into the evening, with medical personnel working to stabilize patients for transport while investigators began documenting the scene for official reports. The scope of the incident required coordination between National Park Service law enforcement, FBI agents specializing in federal land crimes, wildlife biologists, and emergency management officials from multiple states. At 6:30 p.m., Chief Ranger Williams conducted the first official briefing for media representatives who had begun arriving at Mammoth Hot Springs. The story of multiple tourists being mauled by a grizzly bear in the heart of Yellowstone National Park was already attracting national attention, with news crews traveling from Denver, Salt Lake City, and other regional centers to cover the developing story. At approximately 3:45 p.m. this afternoon, a large male grizzly bear attacked a group of tourists visiting Mammoth Hot Springs, Chief Williams announced to the assembled reporters. Multiple people were injured, several critically. The bear was destroyed by ranger personnel after it continued attacking civilians and posed an immediate threat to public safety. "We are coordinating with medical facilities across the region to provide appropriate care for the injured." The carefully worded statement provided basic information while avoiding details that might compromise ongoing investigations or violate privacy rights of victims and their families. However, reporters immediately began asking questions that demonstrated the national significance of the story and the public's fascination with human encounters with apex predators. "Chief Williams, can you confirm how many people were injured in the attack?" asked a reporter from CNN who had driven from Denver. "We have multiple injured parties ranging from minor to critical condition," Chief Williams replied. "Specific numbers and details about individual patients will be provided by medical facilities as appropriate." "What caused the bear to attack? Was this a defensive encounter or predatory behavior?" "The investigation is ongoing. Wildlife biologists are examining all aspects of the incident, including the bear's condition, behavior patterns, and environmental factors that may have contributed to the encounter." The questions continued for nearly an hour, reflecting intense public interest in a story that combined elements of wilderness adventure, natural disaster, and human survival. The Mammoth Hot Springs bear attack was already being compared to famous incidents like the Night of the Grizzlies in Glacier National Park and various attacks in Alaska's wilderness areas. What made the Mammoth Hot Springs incident particularly significant was its location in one of America's most visited national parks, the number of casualties involved, and the clear evidence that the bear had engaged in prolonged predatory behavior rather than defensive action. Wildlife experts would spend months analyzing the attack to understand what had caused such extreme deviation from normal grizzly bear behavior. By evening, preliminary casualty reports began emerging from hospitals across the region where victims had been transported for emergency treatment. The numbers were staggering for a single wildlife incident. 8 people hospitalized in critical condition, 14 others with serious but non-life-threatening injuries, and 21 additional individuals requiring medical evaluation for shock, minor injuries, and psychological trauma. Margaret Patterson, the 78-year-old retired teacher from Schaumburg, had been declared dead at the scene from massive trauma sustained during the bear's initial attack. Her husband, Bill, had been transported to a Salt Lake City hospital for treatment of shock and minor injuries sustained when he attempted to reach his wife during the attack. Tom Kowalski underwent emergency surgery at University of Utah Hospital, where trauma surgeons worked for 8 hours to repair damage from the bear's assault. His injuries included multiple broken ribs, collapsed lung, severe soft tissue lacerations, and internal bleeding that had nearly proven fatal during helicopter transport. His survival remained uncertain even after successful surgery. Craig Phillips, the newlywed teacher who had attempted to help an unconscious tourist, was in critical but stable condition at the same facility. His injuries were primarily soft tissue damage from the bear's claws, though blood loss and shock had complicated his treatment. His wife, Amanda, remained at his bedside, having been transported in the same helicopter despite her own minor injuries from psychological trauma. The Zarnecki sisters, Helena and Dorothy, presented a particularly poignant case for medical personnel. Both elderly women had sustained serious injuries during their encounter with Bear number 211, but their advanced age and underlying health conditions complicated treatment decisions. Helena, 81, was in critical condition with multiple lacerations and possible internal injuries, while 79-year-old Dorothy was stable, but requiring extensive orthopedic surgery to repair damage from her impact with the safety barrier. Amy Chen, the 13-year-old who had been thrown into the glass display case, underwent emergency neurosurgery to address swelling in her brain caused by the impact. Her parents, Robert and Marie Chen, maintained a vigil at Primary Children's Hospital in Salt Lake City, where pediatric specialists were cautiously optimistic about her chances for full recovery. The Goldberg brothers, David and Michael, were both hospitalized in serious condition with injuries that would require multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. David's pre-existing heart condition complicated his treatment, while Michael's injuries included damage to his spinal column that raised concerns about permanent disability. Ranger Patricia Hawkins, who had confronted Bear number 211 in single combat while attempting to protect civilians, was listed in critical but stable condition at a Bozeman hospital. Her injuries included massive lacerations from the bear's claws, broken ribs from the impact with the vehicle, and soft tissue damage that would require reconstructive surgery. Her survival was considered remarkable, given the nature of her encounter with a 400-pound predator. As night fell over Mammoth Hot Springs, the scene began to resemble a crime scene investigation rather than a natural area. Evidence markers indicated locations where attacks had occurred. Photographers documented bloodstains and damaged infrastructure, and investigators measured distances and angles to understand the sequence of events that had led to the most significant bear attack in Yellowstone's recorded history. Bear number 211's carcass was transported to a wildlife laboratory facility where veterinary pathologists would conduct a complete necropsy to understand the factors that had contributed to his extreme behavior. Preliminary examination revealed a male grizzly in poor body condition, with evidence of significant weight loss that suggested prolonged nutritional stress. The bear was approximately 415 pounds, which is substantially underweight for a male of his size and age, reported Dr. Susan Martinez, the wildlife veterinarian conducting the initial examination. We'll be looking for evidence of disease, injury, or other factors that might explain his unusual behavior around humans. The necropsy would reveal additional information that helped explain Bear number 211's actions on May 3rd. The bear's stomach contents showed he had consumed virtually no food for several days prior to the attack, confirming severe nutritional stress. His teeth showed excessive wear patterns that suggested difficulty processing normal food sources, and tissue samples would later reveal elevated stress hormones consistent with prolonged hunger. Environmental factors had also contributed to bear number 211's condition. The unusually warm spring had disrupted traditional feeding patterns, causing early emergence from hibernation before normal food sources became available. Climate change was affecting ecosystems throughout Yellowstone, creating challenges for wildlife that had evolved to exploit predictable seasonal resources. The combination of individual factors affecting bear number 211 and broader environmental changes had created perfect conditions for the kind of human-wildlife conflict that had played out so tragically at Mammoth Hot Springs. Wildlife managers would spend years studying the incident to develop better protocols for preventing similar encounters while maintaining public access to national park resources. As media coverage of the attack intensified over the following days, public debate emerged about wilderness management, tourist safety, and the appropriate balance between wildlife protection and human recreation. The Mammoth Hot Springs bear attack became a focal point for discussions about climate change, ecosystem management, and the risks inherent in wilderness experiences. Some commentators argued that the incident demonstrated the need for more aggressive wildlife management and greater restrictions on bear populations near developed areas. Others maintained that human encroachment into wildlife habitat was the underlying cause of such conflicts, and that better education and safety protocols were needed rather than punitive measures against bear populations. The surviving victims and their families faced a complex mixture of physical recovery, psychological healing, and legal considerations that would extend far beyond the immediate medical treatment. Several families initiated legal proceedings against the National Park Service, arguing that inadequate warning systems and emergency response protocols had contributed to the severity of casualties. The Kowalski family situation was particularly complex. Tom's survival, while remarkable, left him facing months of rehabilitation and permanent disabilities that would affect his ability to work and provide for his family. Rita's nursing income would be insufficient to cover medical expenses and lost earnings, creating financial stress that compounded their emotional trauma. The doctors say Tom might walk again with extensive physical therapy, Rita explained to relatives who had traveled to Salt Lake City to provide support. But he'll never be the same. The damage to his spine and internal organs is permanent. Their children, Michael, Emma, and Danny, were receiving counseling to help process the psychological trauma of witnessing their father's mauling. The family's casual decision to take a vacation to Yellowstone had resulted in life-changing consequences that would affect all of them for decades. Similar challenges faced other survivor families. The Morrison family's comfortable suburban life had been shattered by witnessing extreme violence in what they had expected to be a safe, managed environment. Dr. Morrison's medical knowledge made him acutely aware of how close they had come to losing everything, while his daughters struggled with nightmares and anxiety that interfered with their normal teenage activities. The Chen family focused their attention on Amy's recovery from traumatic brain injury, a process that would require months of rehabilitation and might result in permanent cognitive changes. Robert and Marie's expertise in software engineering and pediatric medicine provided no preparation for navigating the complex world of traumatic brain injury treatment and long-term care planning. The newlyweds, Craig and Amanda Phillips, faced the possibility that Craig's injuries might affect their plans for starting a family and building careers in education. The couple who had chosen Yellowstone for their delayed honeymoon found themselves dealing with medical bills, insurance complications, and trauma counseling that tested their new marriage in ways they had never anticipated. As weeks passed and the immediate medical crisis stabilized into long-term recovery planning, investigators continued their analysis of the factors that had contributed to the Mammoth Hot Springs attack. Their findings would influence wilderness management policies throughout the national park system and contribute to ongoing debates about human-wildlife coexistence in an era of environmental change. The official investigation report, released 6 months after the incident, concluded that bear number 211's attack represented an extremely rare convergence of factors that had created conditions for predatory behavior toward humans. The bear's poor physical condition, disrupted feeding patterns caused by environmental changes, and the coincidental presence of a large group of tourists in his territory had combined to produce a wildlife encounter that exceeded all established behavioral predictions. The report recommended enhanced monitoring of bear populations showing signs of nutritional stress, improved early warning systems for areas where human-wildlife conflicts might occur, and modified emergency response protocols that recognize the possibility of prolonged predatory encounters rather than brief defensive situations. For the survivors of the Mammoth Hot Springs bear attack, such policy recommendations provided little comfort as they continued their long journey of physical and psychological recovery. The 10 minutes of terror they had experienced on May 3, 2024, had permanently altered their lives and demonstrated the fragile nature of human safety in wilderness environments where apex predators still ruled. The story of bear number 211 and his encounter with 43 tourists from Chicago became a case study in wildlife management programs, a cautionary tale told by wilderness guides, and a reminder that even in America's most carefully managed national parks, the power of wild nature could still assert itself with devastating consequences for those unprepared to face it. The families who had boarded a charter bus in Chicago for what they expected to be a routine sightseeing tour had instead experienced one of the most significant wildlife attacks in National Park Service history. Their survival and recovery would serve as testament to human resilience in the face of natural forces that remained as dangerous and unpredictable as they had been when the first European explorers ventured into the American wilderness more than 2 centuries earlier. Years later, survivors would still gather annually on May 3rd to remember those who had been lost and to support each other in their ongoing recovery. The date that had begun as the start of a dream vacation to one of America's natural wonders had instead become a permanent reminder of their shared encounter with the raw power of nature and their collective survival of circumstances that had tested the limits of human endurance and courage. The Mammoth Hot Springs bear attack would be remembered not only for its scope and severity, but also for the extraordinary acts of heroism displayed by ordinary people who risked their lives to help others, the dedication of emergency responders who put themselves in danger to protect civilians, and the resilience of survivors who rebuilt their lives after experiencing trauma that exceeded their worst nightmares. In the end, the story of May 3rd, 2024, served as both a tragic reminder of wilderness dangers and an inspiring testament to the human capacity for survival, recovery, and mutual support in the face of overwhelming adversity. The tourists from Chicago, who had sought beauty and wonder in America's wilderness, had found both, though in forms they had never expected and at costs they had never imagined possible. The next stories. November 3rd, 2025. Kodiak bear destroys cabin, kills 2 hunters in Alaska wilderness. The first snowfall of the season began at 3:47 a.m. on November 1st, 2025, blanketing the Katmai Peninsula in a pristine white shroud that would soon be stained crimson. Meteorologist Sarah Chen at the Anchorage Weather Service recorded the temperature drop from 42 degrees Fahrenheit to 28 degrees in less than 3 hours, creating what wildlife biologist Dr. Marcus Thornfield would later describe as perfect conditions for a feeding frenzy. The early winter storm system, designated as Storm Complex Alpha 7 by the National Weather Service, carried with it winds gusting up to 65 miles per hour and deposited nearly 14 inches of snow across the remote wilderness area where brothers Caleb Monroe, 34, and Ryan Monroe, 29, had established their hunting camp just 72 hours earlier. Caleb Monroe stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with the weathered hands of a man who had spent 15 years working construction in Fairbanks before inheriting his father's auto repair shop 3 years prior. His younger brother Ryan, 5 feet 10 inches with the lean build of a former high school cross-country runner, worked as a paramedic for the Fairbanks Fire Department and had completed wilderness emergency medical training just 6 months before their fateful trip. Both men carried identical Remington Model 700 rifles chambered in .30-06 Springfield, weapons their grandfather Thomas Monroe had purchased in 1987 and passed down through the family, along with detailed hand-drawn maps of prime hunting locations throughout south-central Alaska. The Monroe brothers had driven Thomas Monroe's modified 1995 Ford F-250 pickup truck, equipped with oversized tires and a reinforced suspension system, along the Katmai Pass Road for 8 hours on October 29th, stopping every 45 minutes to check their GPS coordinates against the hand-drawn maps their grandfather had meticulously updated until his death from a heart attack in February 2023. The truck carried 2,000 pounds of supplies, including a portable generator, 3 weeks' worth of freeze-dried meals, medical supplies, ammunition, two-way radios, and construction materials needed to reinforce the hunting cabin their family had used for 3 generations. The cabin itself measured 24 feet by 16 feet and had been constructed in 1962 by Thomas Monroe and his brother William, using locally harvested spruce logs, each measuring 8 to 12 inches in diameter. The structure sat on concrete pylons sunk 4 feet into the permafrost, positioned exactly 2.3 miles northeast of Fish Creek and 0.8 miles south of the main Katmai Peninsula Wildlife Corridor that connected the coastal salmon runs to the interior berry patches. Weather records from the Alaska Climate Research Center showed that November temperatures in this specific location averaged between 15 and 32 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind patterns typically flowing northeast to southwest at sustained speeds of 12 to 18 miles per hour. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a wildlife biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, who had studied Kodiak bear behavior for 12 years, would later testify before the Alaska State Legislature that the early snowfall had disrupted normal hibernation patterns for approximately 60% of the peninsula's brown bear population. Her research, published in the Journal of Wildlife Management 3 months after the Monroe incident, documented that bears weighing over 800 pounds, 100 pounds, required an additional 4 to 6 weeks of feeding time when early winter weather systems reduced their access to salmon runs and late-season berry patches. The bears, driven by what scientists term hyperphagia or extreme hunger, would consume up to 20,000 calories per day in preparation for hibernation, leading to increasingly aggressive behavior when food sources became scarce. Game Warden Lieutenant James Harrison, a 23-year veteran of Alaska Fish and Game Enforcement, had received reports of unusual bear activity in the Katmai Peninsula region, beginning on October 15, 2025. Commercial fishing captain Maria Santos reported that a brown bear, estimated to weigh over 1,000 pounds, had destroyed 3 of her salmon smoking racks near Fish Creek, consuming approximately 60 pounds of prepared fish and leaving claw marks 4 inches deep in the cedar support posts. Wilderness guide Robert Bear Hendricks, who had led hunting expeditions in the region for 18 years, filed an incident report on October 22nd, describing an encounter with an unusually large and aggressive brown bear that had stalked his party for over 2 hours before finally withdrawing. The Munro brothers had been unaware of these reports when they departed Fairbanks at 5:30 a.m. on October 29th, following a farewell breakfast at Mabel's Diner, where waitress Dorothy Kim would later recall serving them the biggest portions of eggs and bacon I'd ever plated while they discussed their planned 2-week hunting expedition. Caleb had kissed his wife Jessica goodbye and promised their 8-year-old daughter Emma that he would bring back the biggest deer in all of Alaska, while Ryan had embraced his girlfriend of 3 years, nurse practitioner Amanda Torres, who made him promise to check in via satellite phone every 48 hours. The drive to their hunting grounds took them through some of Alaska's most spectacular and dangerous wilderness, following the park's highway north before turning west onto increasingly remote gravel roads that wound through dense forests of white spruce, paper birch, and quaking aspen. They passed through the village of Lake Minchumina, population 87, where they stopped to refuel at Charlie's General Store and spoke with store owner Charles Hoffman about recent wildlife sightings in the area. Hoffman, 73 years old with 52 years of experience living in the Alaska wilderness, warned them about increased bear activity and recommended they make plenty of noise and keep those rifles loaded at all times. Their route continued west, along increasingly primitive roads, with the final 23 miles requiring 4-wheel drive to navigate muddy creek crossings and steep grades that tested the Ford's upgraded transmission and transfer case. The brothers took turns driving and navigating, using both GPS coordinates and their grandfather's detailed maps to locate the unmarked trail that led to their family's hunting cabin. The trail itself stretched for 1.7 miles through dense underbrush and required them to make 3 separate trips to transport all their gear from the truck to the cabin site. The cabin's interior featured rough-hewn log walls chinked with moss and clay, a stone fireplace built from river rocks, and sleeping accommodations for 6 people using military surplus cots arranged along the north wall. A propane cooking stove sat on a hand-built wooden counter next to shelves stocked with canned goods, first aid supplies, and hunting equipment that previous generations of Munro men had accumulated over the decades. The structure had weathered 63 Alaska winters and showed signs of repeated repairs, with newer logs replacing sections damaged by weather, wildlife, and the passage of time. Caleb and Ryan spent their first 2 days conducting routine maintenance on the cabin, replacing loose chinking, reinforcing door frames, and clearing accumulated debris from the immediate area. They established a daily routine that began at 5:30 a.m. with coffee and freeze-dried breakfast rations, followed by hunting excursions that typically lasted 6 to 8 hours. Both men were experienced hunters who practiced strict safety protocols, including maintaining loaded firearms when outside the cabin, traveling in pairs at all times, and establishing predetermined meeting points in case they became separated during their expeditions. The weather during their first week remained unseasonably warm, with daytime temperatures reaching 45 degrees Fahrenheit and relatively calm winds that made for ideal hunting conditions. They successfully harvested 2 white-tailed deer on November 1st, following tracking protocols their grandfather had taught them during childhood hunting trips to these same grounds. The deer, a mature buck weighing approximately 160 pounds and a doe weighing 120 pounds, provided enough venison to fill their truck's coolers and ensure successful completion of their expedition. Ryan Munro's wilderness medical training proved valuable when Caleb suffered a minor injury while field dressing the buck, sustaining a 2-inch laceration on his left forearm when his skinning knife slipped during the process. Ryan cleaned and bandaged the wound using supplies from their comprehensive first aid kit, which included antibiotics, pain medications, and emergency communication equipment. The incident prompted both brothers to review their safety procedures and reminded them of the dangerous nature of their remote location, where the nearest medical facility was Anchorage General Hospital, over 300 miles away. The first signs of unusual wildlife activity occurred on the evening of November 2nd, when both brothers heard what Caleb later described as the most terrifying sound I've ever experienced approximately 100 yards southeast of their cabin. The sound, which lasted nearly 30 seconds, began as a low, rumbling growl that escalated into a series of aggressive roars and ended with what Ryan characterized as breathing so heavy and deep it seemed to shake the ground. They responded by loading their rifles, securing all food items inside the cabin's bear-proof storage containers, and maintaining a watch schedule throughout the night. Wildlife audio specialist Dr. Patricia Kumamoto of the University of Alaska Fairbanks would later analyze recordings captured by the brothers' trail cameras and identify the vocalizations as belonging to a mature male Kodiak brown bear weighing between 900 and 1,200 pounds. Her analysis, published in the Alaska Wildlife Research Journal, noted that the vocal patterns indicated extreme agitation and territorial behavior consistent with a bear defending a claimed food source or establishing dominance over a territory. The recordings also captured what Dr. Kumamoto described as abnormally heavy respiratory patterns, suggesting the animal was experiencing significant physical exertion or stress. Temperature readings from the brothers' digital weather station showed a dramatic drop beginning at 11:30 p.m. on November 2nd, falling from 38 degrees to 19 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 5 hours. Wind speeds increased from 8 miles per hour to sustained gusts of 45 miles per hour, creating what the National Weather Service classified as dangerous wind chill conditions, with effective temperatures dropping to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. These conditions, according to Dr. Vasquez's research, typically trigger what she termed desperate feeding behavior in bears who have not yet accumulated sufficient fat reserves for hibernation. Both brothers managed only intermittent sleep during the night of November 2nd, with their watch schedule requiring one person to remain alert while the other rested for 2-hour periods. Caleb's journal entries, recovered during the investigation, recorded multiple instances of heavy footsteps circling the cabin between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., along with what he described as scraping and sniffing sounds along the cabin's exterior walls. Ryan noted in his own journal that the sounds seemed to originate from an animal much larger than any bear we've encountered during previous trips, and expressed concern about their situation should the weather conditions prevent them from returning to their truck. Dawn on November 3rd arrived at 7:42 a.m. with overcast skies and temperatures holding steady at 21 degrees Fahrenheit. Both brothers had managed approximately 3 hours of sleep each and began their morning routine with extra vigilance, checking the cabin's perimeter before venturing outside to inspect the area around their structure. What they discovered in the fresh snow would later be documented by Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Michael Rodriguez as the largest bear tracks ever officially measured in Alaska law enforcement history. The tracks measured 14 inches in length and 8 inches in width at the heel pad, with claw marks extending an additional 3 to 4 inches beyond the toe impressions. The stride length between tracks averaged 42 inches, indicating an animal moving at a deliberate walking pace while investigating the cabin's exterior. Dr. Vasquez's analysis of photographs taken during the investigation determined that the tracks belonged to a mature male Kodiak brown bear, weighing between 1,100 and 1,300 pounds, placing it among the largest specimens ever documented in Alaska. More disturbing than the size of the tracks was their pattern around the cabin, which showed the bear had circled the structure at least 6 times during the night, pausing at each window and door to investigate scents and sounds from within. The animal had also approached the brothers' meat processing area, where they had cleaned their deer harvest the previous day, and had apparently spent considerable time investigating residual blood and tissue remains, despite the brothers' efforts to clean the area thoroughly. Ryan Munro's final journal entry, written at 9:15 a.m. on November 3rd, recorded their decision to complete processing of their deer harvest and begin preparations for departure the following morning. He noted that both brothers felt increasingly uncomfortable with the bear's proximity and behavior, but believed they could safely complete their hunt if they maintained proper security protocols and avoided any activities that might attract additional attention from wildlife. His final written words were, "Caleb thinks we should leave today, but weather forecast shows clearing conditions tomorrow. We'll finish meat processing this morning and reassess situation this afternoon." The brothers began their final day's work by stoking the cabin's fireplace to provide adequate light and warmth for meat processing activities. They arranged their deer harvest on a makeshift butcher table constructed from plywood and sawhorses, with both animals suspended from ceiling beams to facilitate proper field dressing and butchering procedures. Their grandfather's hunting guides, passed down through 3 generations, provided detailed instructions for processing game meat in remote wilderness conditions, including proper temperature control, sanitation procedures, and preservation techniques. Weather conditions continued to deteriorate throughout the morning, with wind speeds increasing to sustained gusts of 55 miles per hour and intermittent snow squalls reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. The brothers' satellite phone received its last successful transmission at 10:43 a.m. when Ryan contacted Amanda Torres to confirm their planned departure schedule and reassure her of their safety status. Cell phone tower records show that the call lasted 7 minutes and included Ryan's promise to be extra careful today and his expression of love for Amanda, whom he had planned to propose to during their planned Christmas vacation to Hawaii. The last known photographs taken by either brother were captured at 11:28 a.m. using Caleb's digital camera, showing both men working to process their deer harvest inside the cabin's main room. The images reveal their rifles leaning against the wall near the front door, approximately 15 feet from their work area, while their hunting knives and processing equipment occupied the center of the room. Both men appeared relaxed and focused on their work, with no visible signs of concern or awareness of the approaching danger that would claim their lives within the next few hours. Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a forensic pathologist with the Alaska State Medical Examiner's Office, would later analyze these final photographs to establish the precise timeline of events leading to the brothers' deaths. Her report noted that both men were working with their backs to the cabin's windows and appeared to be engaged in detailed butchering work that would have required their complete attention and prevented them from monitoring their surroundings for wildlife activity. The positioning of their firearms, while following proper safety protocols for indoor activities, placed the weapons beyond immediate reach should an emergency situation develop. Seismographic equipment operated by the Alaska Earthquake Center recorded the first impact against the cabin structure at 12:17:33 p.m. on November 3rd, 2025. The impact registered as a magnitude 0.8 seismic event and was followed by a series of smaller impacts occurring at approximately 3-second intervals for the next 47 seconds. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a seismologist with the University of Alaska Anchorage, would later testify that the impact patterns were consistent with a large animal striking a wooden structure repeatedly with tremendous force. The Kodiak brown bear that destroyed the Monroe cabin and killed both brothers measured an estimated 9 feet 4 inches in length and weighed approximately 1,200 pounds, according to measurements taken during the subsequent investigation. Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologist Dr. Stephen Blackwood, who examined physical evidence at the scene, determined that the animal was a mature male between 12 and 15 years old, placing it in the prime of its physical development and territorial dominance. Hair samples recovered from the cabin's exterior walls confirmed the animal's species and provided DNA evidence that would later be used to track and identify the specific bear responsible for the attack. The attack itself began when the bear approached the cabin's north wall, where the brothers had been processing their deer harvest near the structure's largest window. Forensic analysis of the scene revealed that the animal initially tested the cabin's structural integrity by striking the logs near the window frame with its front paws, creating the initial seismic impacts recorded by earthquake monitoring equipment. The bear's behavior during this phase indicated what Dr. Vasquez described as calculated assessment of the obstacle between itself and the food sources it had detected inside the structure. Caleb Munro's autopsy report, conducted by Dr. Morrison on November 7, 2025, revealed that he was the first brother to become aware of the danger when the bear's initial impacts against the cabin wall caused hanging utensils and equipment to rattle and fall from their storage hooks. Physical evidence suggested that Caleb moved toward the front door, presumably to retrieve his rifle, but had covered less than 8 feet when the bear's assault on the structure escalated to full destructive force. The Kodiak bear's method of entering the cabin demonstrated the incredible power and determination that makes these animals among North America's most dangerous predators. Rather than attempting to breach the door or windows, the bear focused its attack on a section of the north wall where the logs had been weakened by decades of weather exposure and previous repair work. Using its front paws and shoulder mass, estimated at over 400 pounds of concentrated force, the bear struck the same section of wall repeatedly until the logs began to separate and the chinking material crumbled under the assault. Ryan Munro's position near the meat processing table placed him closest to the point where the bear eventually breached the wall. His autopsy revealed defensive wounds on both forearms and hands, indicating that he attempted to protect himself when the wall suddenly gave way and the massive bear burst through the opening it had created. The force of the bear's entry sent tools, equipment, and furniture flying across the cabin's interior, while both brothers scrambled to reach their firearms. Dr. Morrison's forensic analysis determined that the entire attack sequence, from the bear's entry into the cabin until both brothers had sustained fatal injuries, lasted no more than 90 seconds. The confined space of the cabin's interior, combined with the bear's massive size and aggressive state, created what she described as an impossible survival scenario, where neither victim had adequate time or space to mount an effective defense against their attacker. Caleb Munro sustained his fatal injuries while attempting to reach his rifle, which remained leaning against the wall near the front door. The bear's initial charge knocked him backward into the cabin's stone fireplace, causing severe head trauma and multiple rib fractures. His final moments, reconstructed through forensic evidence, showed that he continued fighting despite his injuries, using a hunting knife to inflict several wounds on the bear before succumbing to massive internal bleeding caused by the animal's claws and teeth. Ryan Munro's death occurred near the cabin's center, where he had been working when the attack began. His wilderness medical training enabled him to survive the initial assault longer than his brother, and evidence suggested he attempted to use his medical supplies to treat both his own injuries and those of his brother, even as the bear continued its attack. His final act was reaching for the satellite phone in an attempt to call for emergency assistance. But the device had been damaged beyond use when the bear destroyed the equipment table during its rampage through the cabin. The bear's behavior during the attack exhibited characteristics that Dr. Vasquez described as extreme predatory aggression combined with territorial dominance display. Unlike typical defensive bear encounters, where animals usually withdraw after eliminating perceived threats, this bear remained inside the cabin for an estimated 20 to 30 minutes after both brothers had died, continuing to destroy equipment and consume portions of the deer harvest that had initially attracted its attention. Physical evidence documented by crime scene investigators showed that the bear systematically destroyed nearly every item inside the cabin, including furniture, cooking equipment, stored food supplies, and personal belongings. The animal's claws, measuring up to 4 inches in length, gouged marks into every wooden surface within the structure, creating what Sergeant Rodriguez described as a scene of total devastation, unlike anything I've encountered in 25 years of law enforcement. The bear's departure from the cabin occurred sometime between 1 p.m. and 1:30 p.m., based on analysis of blood evidence and the animal's movement patterns through the surrounding area. Rather than immediately leaving the vicinity, the bear remained near the cabin for several hours, consuming portions of the deer harvest and investigating other potential food sources in the brothers' equipment cache. Trail camera footage recovered during the investigation showed the animal moving through the area until approximately 4 p.m., before finally traveling northeast toward the main wildlife corridor. The first indication that something had gone wrong at the Monroe hunting camp came at 6 p.m. on November 3rd, when Amanda Torres attempted to contact Ryan via satellite phone for their scheduled evening check-in call. When repeated attempts to establish communication failed, Amanda contacted Jessica Monroe, Caleb's wife, to determine whether she had received any messages from the brothers. By 8 p.m., both women had grown sufficiently concerned to contact Alaska State Troopers and request a welfare check on the remote hunting camp. Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Michael Rodriguez received the welfare check request at 8:43 p.m. and immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation based on the remote location, weather conditions, and lack of communication from experienced outdoorsmen who had maintained regular contact schedules during previous expeditions. He initiated emergency protocols that included notification of Alaska Rescue Coordination Center, Alaska Department of Fish and Game Enforcement, and local search and rescue organizations. Weather conditions on the evening of November 3rd prevented immediate deployment of aircraft or ground rescue teams, with wind speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour and visibility reduced to less than 50 feet due to blowing snow and freezing precipitation. Rescue Coordination Center Commander Colonel Patricia Hayes made the decision to postpone search operations until dawn on November 4th, when improved weather conditions would allow safe deployment of personnel and equipment to the remote wilderness location. The delay in launching rescue operations proved irrelevant to the brothers' survival, as subsequent investigation determined that both men had died during the initial bear attack on the afternoon of November 3rd. However, the inability to respond immediately to the emergency call highlighted the extreme challenges of conducting wilderness rescue operations in Alaska's remote regions, where weather conditions and vast distances often prevent rapid response to emergency situations. Amanda Torres and Jessica Monroe spent the night of November 3rd at Alaska State Trooper Headquarters in Fairbanks, where Victim Services Coordinator Mary Patterson provided support and regular updates on search and rescue preparations. Both women later described the experience as the longest night of our lives, as they waited for weather conditions to improve sufficiently to allow rescue teams to reach the remote hunting cabin. The search operation began at dawn on November 4th with deployment of Alaska Air National Guard rescue helicopters equipped with specialized winter weather equipment and experienced wilderness rescue personnel. The lead aircraft, piloted by Major Robert Chen, carried a team of Alaska State Troopers, emergency medical technicians, and wildlife enforcement officers capable of handling both rescue operations and potential dangerous wildlife encounters. Major Chen's helicopter reached the area of the Monroe hunting camp at 9:32 a.m. on November 4th. But initial flyovers failed to locate the cabin due to heavy snow accumulation and terrain features that obscured the structure from aerial observation. The search team established a landing zone approximately half a mile from the cabin's suspected location and began ground operations using GPS coordinates provided by the brothers' family members and their previously filed hunting plans. Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, leading the ground search team, would later describe the approach to the Monroe cabin as one of the most challenging and dangerous operations of my career. The team encountered multiple sets of large bear tracks in the snow, including the massive prints left by the animal responsible for the attack, while navigating through dense undergrowth and difficult terrain made more treacherous by snow and ice accumulation. The search team first encountered physical evidence of the disaster at 10:47 a.m., when Trooper James Mackenzie discovered scattered equipment and debris approximately 50 yards from the cabin site. The debris field included torn fabric from hunting clothing, destroyed camping equipment, and what appeared to be portions of meat processing materials that had been scattered by wildlife activity. The team immediately recognized that they were approaching a scene of significant violence and radioed for additional support and specialized personnel. The destroyed cabin came into view at 11:03 a.m., presenting what Sergeant Rodriguez described as a scene of total devastation that defied belief. The structure's north wall had been completely demolished, with logs scattered across a 40-foot radius and the cabin's interior contents distributed throughout the surrounding area. The roof had partially collapsed and snow had accumulated inside the structure, obscuring much of the scene's physical evidence and creating hazardous conditions for the investigation team. The discovery of human remains occurred simultaneously with the team's initial examination of the cabin's exterior. Trooper Mackenzie located Caleb Monroe's body near the cabin's front entrance, partially buried under debris from the collapsed roof structure. Ryan Monroe's remains were found inside the cabin near what had been the meat processing area, covered by snow and scattered equipment. Both bodies showed extensive trauma consistent with a large animal attack, confirming the search team's worst fears about the fate of the Monroe brothers. Emergency medical technician Sarah Williams, who had responded to hundreds of emergency calls during her 12-year career with Fairbanks Emergency Medical Services, later testified that the brothers' injuries were the most severe animal attack trauma I have ever encountered. Her initial field assessment determined that both men had died from their injuries several hours before the rescue team's arrival. Eliminating any possibility of life-saving medical intervention, the search team's discovery of the massive bear tracks surrounding the cabin confirmed their suspicions about the nature of the attack and raised immediate concerns about the potential presence of the dangerous animal in the immediate area. Sergeant Rodriguez implemented security protocols that required all personnel to remain within sight of each other, while armed Alaska Department of Fish and Game officers maintained perimeter security around the investigation scene. Dr. Stephen Blackwood, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologist who responded to the scene, began immediate documentation of the bear evidence, while other team members secured the human remains and began preliminary investigation of the cabin's interior. His initial measurements of the bear tracks confirmed that the animal responsible for the attack was among the largest brown bears ever documented in Alaska, with track dimensions exceeding previous records maintained by the department. The logistical challenges of conducting a death investigation and evidence collection in the remote wilderness location required additional personnel and equipment that took several hours to deploy from Fairbanks. Alaska State Trooper crime scene investigator Lieutenant David Park arrived at the scene at 2:30 p.m. aboard a second helicopter, along with additional medical personnel and specialized equipment needed for processing the complex crime scene. Lieutenant Park's initial assessment of the scene revealed what he described as evidence of the most violent animal attack in Alaska law enforcement history. The cabin's interior showed signs of systematic destruction by an animal of extraordinary size and strength, with every piece of furniture, equipment, and personal belongings damaged or destroyed. Blood evidence covered virtually every surface within the structure, creating what Park characterized as a three-dimensional crime scene requiring innovative documentation techniques. The process of documenting and collecting evidence from the scene required nearly 8 hours of careful work, with team members using specialized photography equipment, measuring tools, and evidence collection materials designed for outdoor crime scene processing. Weather conditions continued to complicate the investigation, with intermittent snow squalls and sub-freezing temperatures creating challenges for both personnel safety and evidence preservation. The recovery of the Monroe brothers' remains required coordination between multiple agencies and careful handling procedures designed to preserve evidence while treating the victims with appropriate dignity and respect. Alaska State Medical Examiner Dr. Rebecca Morrison personally supervised the removal process, ensuring that all potential forensic evidence was preserved for subsequent laboratory analysis and autopsy procedures. The transportation of evidence and remains from the remote wilderness location to Fairbanks required multiple helicopter flights and careful coordination with aviation authorities to ensure safe operations in challenging weather conditions. The final evacuation flight departed the scene at 6:45 p.m. on November 4th, carrying the last of the investigation team members and marking the conclusion of the initial emergency response phase of the Monroe case. News of the brothers' deaths reached their families at Alaska State Trooper headquarters at 7:30 p.m. on November 4th, when Sergeant Rodriguez personally delivered notification to Amanda Torres and Jessica Monroe. Victim Services Coordinator Mary Patterson provided immediate support services and began coordinating the complex process of family notification, media relations, and funeral arrangements that would follow the completion of the official investigation. The impact of the Monroe brothers' deaths extended far beyond their immediate families, affecting the close-knit community of Fairbanks, where both men had been well-known and respected members of local organizations and businesses. Caleb's auto repair shop, Monroe Brothers Automotive, had served the community for 3 years and employed 6 local residents who suddenly faced uncertain employment futures. Ryan's colleagues at Fairbanks Fire Department had lost an experienced paramedic whose wilderness medical skills had saved numerous lives during remote emergency responses. Local media coverage of the Monroe case began within hours of the official notification to families, with KFAR Radio and the Fairbanks Daily News Miner providing initial reports based on information released by Alaska State Trooper Public Information Officer Lieutenant Sandra Davis. The story quickly gained statewide attention as details of the massive bear attack spread through Alaska's outdoor recreation and hunting communities. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game faced immediate pressure from media and public safety advocates to locate and destroy the bear responsible for the attack, while wildlife conservation organizations argued for protection of the animal and its natural habitat. Dr. Elena Vasquez, speaking as the department's chief bear researcher, emphasized that the attack represented natural predator behavior during a period of environmental stress caused by unusual weather patterns and habitat disruption. Commissioner of Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Robert Mitchell, called an emergency meeting on November 5th to develop a response plan that would address public safety concerns while maintaining science-based wildlife management policies. The meeting included representatives from Alaska state troopers, emergency management agencies, hunting organizations, and wildlife conservation groups, all seeking to balance competing interests and policy objectives. The decision to track and locate the bear responsible for the Monroe attack was made during the November 5th emergency meeting, with Commissioner Mitchell authorizing deployment of specialized wildlife tracking teams equipped with tranquilizer equipment and GPS tracking collars. The operation's primary objectives included public safety assessment, behavioral observation, and potential relocation of the animal to a more remote wilderness area. Dr. Stephen Blackwood led the bear tracking operation, utilizing DNA evidence collected at the Monroe cabin site and specialized tracking dogs provided by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The team began operations on November 6th, following the animal's trail from the cabin site toward the northeast along established wildlife corridors that connected coastal feeding areas with interior den sites. The tracking operation encountered the bear on November 8th at a location approximately 12 miles northeast of the Monroe cabin, where the animal had established a temporary feeding site near a natural salmon run. The bear's behavior during the encounter appeared normal for the species and season, showing none of the extreme aggression that had characterized the cabin attack 3 days earlier. Wildlife veterinarian Dr. Michael Torres successfully tranquilized the bear and supervised installation of a GPS tracking collar that would allow continuous monitoring of the animal's movements and behavior patterns. Physical examination of the sedated bear confirmed its massive size, with measurements of 9 feet 4 inches in length and an estimated weight of 1,200 pounds, placing it among the largest specimens ever handled by Alaska Department of Fish and Game personnel. The bear's physical condition appeared normal for the species and season, with adequate fat reserves for hibernation and no signs of disease or injury that might explain its aggressive behavior during the cabin attack. Blood samples and tissue specimens were collected for laboratory analysis to test for rabies, toxins, or other medical conditions that could potentially cause abnormal behavior in wild animals. Dr. Vasquez's analysis of the tracking collar data revealed that the bear had returned to normal behavioral patterns following the cabin attack, traveling through established territory and feeding on natural food sources without exhibiting unusual aggression toward humans or other animals. The data supported her theory that the attack had been triggered by the combination of early winter weather conditions, food scarcity, and the powerful attractant of the brothers' deer processing activities. The decision to relocate the bear rather than destroy it was announced on November 12th, following extensive consultation with wildlife management experts and review of the tracking data collected during the previous week. Commissioner Mitchell emphasized that the bear's behavior following the attack suggested it posed no ongoing threat to public safety and that relocation would serve both conservation objectives and community safety concerns. The bear relocation operation took place on November 15th, with the animal transported by helicopter to a remote wilderness area approximately 200 miles northeast of the attack site. The new location provided abundant natural food sources and minimal human contact, reducing the likelihood of future conflicts while allowing the animal to complete its natural hibernation cycle. The autopsy of Caleb Monroe was conducted on November 6th at the Alaska State Medical Examiner's Office in Anchorage, with Dr. Rebecca Morrison leading a team of forensic pathologists, toxicologists, and DNA analysts. The comprehensive examination required over 6 hours to complete and provided detailed documentation of the injuries sustained during the bear attack. The toxicology results confirmed both brothers had been sober and alert at the time of their deaths. Dr. Morrison's autopsy report on Caleb Monroe detailed 37 separate injuries caused by the bear's claws and teeth, including penetrating wounds to the chest and abdomen, multiple rib fractures, and severe head trauma that would have rendered him unconscious within minutes of the attack's beginning. The pattern and severity of injuries confirmed that the bear had focused its attack on vital areas and continued assaulting the victim even after defensive responses had ceased. The autopsy of Ryan Monroe, conducted on November 7th, revealed 42 separate injuries with a similar pattern of claw and bite marks concentrated on the head, neck, chest, and arms. Dr. Morrison noted that Ryan's wounds included defensive injuries on his forearms and hands, indicating that his medical training had enabled him to maintain consciousness and attempt self-protection longer than his brother during the attack. Toxicology results for both brothers confirmed the absence of alcohol, illegal drugs, or prescription medications that might have impaired their judgment or reaction times during the bear encounter. Blood chemistry analysis revealed normal glucose levels and no evidence of medical conditions that could have prevented them from responding appropriately to the emergency situation. The forensic analysis of physical evidence collected from the cabin site required several weeks to complete, with multiple laboratories analyzing blood samples, hair specimens, claw marks, and bite impressions found throughout the structure. DNA analysis confirmed that all animal evidence originated from a single bear, supporting witness accounts and tracking data that identified one specific animal as responsible for both deaths. Alaska State Trooper investigators completed their reconstruction of events on November 20th, producing a comprehensive report that detailed the timeline of the attack and the factors that contributed to its tragic outcome. The investigation found no evidence of criminal activity, equipment failure, or human negligence that might have prevented the brothers' deaths, concluding that the incident represented an unavoidable wildlife encounter during extreme environmental conditions. The Monroe family's legal representation, provided by Fairbanks attorney Margaret Sullivan, reviewed the investigation findings and concluded that no basis existed for civil litigation against any government agencies or equipment manufacturers. The family's primary concern focused on ensuring that the investigation's findings would be used to improve wilderness safety education and emergency response procedures for future hunting expeditions. Insurance settlements for both brothers' deaths totaled over $800,000, with life insurance policies, accidental death benefits, and workers' compensation providing financial support for their surviving family members. Jessica Monroe received $450,000 to support herself and 8-year-old Emma, while Amanda Torres received $350,000 along with Ryan's pension benefits from Fairbanks Fire Department. The Monroe Brothers Automotive Shop continued operations under Jessica Monroe's management, with master mechanic Tony Ricci assuming responsibility for daily operations and customer service. The business became a memorial to Caleb's memory, with several customers establishing a scholarship fund in his name to support local students pursuing automotive technology education. Ryan Monroe's position at Fairbanks Fire Department remained vacant for 6 months following his death, with department officials stating that his wilderness medical expertise and emergency response experience would be extremely difficult to replace. The department eventually established a memorial training program in Ryan's name, focusing on wilderness emergency medical procedures and remote area rescue operations. The psychological impact of the Monroe brothers' deaths extended throughout the Fairbanks community and Alaska's outdoor recreation community, with many experienced hunters and outdoorsmen expressing increased concern about bear safety and wilderness travel. Several hunting outfitters reported cancellations and requests for additional security measures during expeditions planned for the 2026 hunting season. Amanda Torres required extensive counseling and psychological support following Ryan's death, with post-traumatic stress symptoms including nightmares, anxiety attacks, and difficulty returning to her nursing duties at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital. She eventually relocated to Seattle, Washington, where she accepted a position at Harborview Medical Center and began rebuilding her life away from the painful memories associated with Alaska. Jessica Monroe's adjustment to widowhood proved equally challenging, particularly given the responsibility of explaining her father's death to 8-year-old Emma Monroe. Child psychologist Dr. Sarah Henderson provided family counseling services and helped Emma process her grief while maintaining normal school and social activities. The family remained in Fairbanks, where community support and extended family relationships provided stability during the difficult adjustment period. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game used the Monroe case to develop improved bear safety educational materials and revise protocols for hunting expeditions in known bear habitat. Commissioner Mitchell announced on December 15, 2025, that the department would require enhanced bear safety training for all hunting license applicants and would provide updated educational materials at no cost to hunters and outdoor recreation enthusiasts. Dr. Elena Vasquez's research into the environmental factors that contributed to the Monroe attack was published in the Journal of Wildlife Management in March 2026. Providing scientific analysis of the relationship between climate change, habitat disruption, and wildlife behavior patterns. Her work became a cornerstone reference for wildlife managers throughout North America dealing with similar human-wildlife conflict situations. The Alaska State Legislature conducted hearings on wilderness safety and emergency response procedures during the 2026 legislative session, with testimony from the Monroe family, rescue personnel, and wildlife management experts. The hearings resulted in increased funding for emergency communication infrastructure in remote areas and enhanced training for search and rescue personnel. Memorial services for both brothers were held on November 12, 2025, at the Fairbanks Community Church, with over 400 people attending to honor their memory and support their surviving family members. Alaska Governor Patricia Dunleavy delivered remarks praising the brothers' contributions to their community and expressing condolences to their families and friends. The Monroe family established the Caleb and Ryan Monroe Memorial Foundation in December 2025. Focusing on wilderness safety education and emergency response training for Alaska residents and visitors. The foundation's initial funding of $200,000 came from donations collected during the memorial services and ongoing contributions from community members and businesses. The bear responsible for the Monroe brothers' deaths successfully completed hibernation during the winter of 2025 to 2026 and was observed by wildlife researchers during the following summer in its new territory. GPS tracking data showed normal behavior patterns with no signs of human-wildlife conflict, supporting the decision to relocate rather than destroy the animal. The Monroe cabin site remained undisturbed throughout the winter of 2025 to 2026, with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game restricting access to the area to allow natural recovery processes and prevent attraction of additional wildlife to the location. The department planned to remove remaining debris during the summer of 2026 and restore the site to natural wilderness conditions. The case attracted national attention from wildlife management organizations and outdoor recreation groups, with the Monroe attack cited as an example of the increasing frequency and severity of human-wildlife conflicts in North American wilderness areas. Several universities incorporated the case into their wildlife management and outdoor recreation curricula as a study example of complex human-environment interactions. Documentary filmmaker David Chen began production of a feature-length film about the Monroe case in early 2026, with cooperation from the family and Alaska authorities. The project aimed to educate viewers about wilderness safety while honoring the memory of the brothers and highlighting the challenges faced by wildlife management agencies in balancing conservation and public safety objectives. The Monroe brothers' story continued to influence Alaska's outdoor recreation community throughout 2026, with hunting guides and outfitters implementing enhanced safety protocols and emergency communication procedures based on lessons learned from the tragic incident. The Alaska Professional Hunters Association established new certification requirements that included mandatory bear safety training and emergency response procedures. The long-term impact of the Monroe case extended beyond Alaska's borders, influencing wildlife management policies and outdoor recreation safety standards throughout North America. The combination of environmental factors, animal behavior, and human activities that led to the brothers' deaths provided valuable insights for preventing similar tragedies in other wilderness areas. As the first anniversary of the attack approached in November 2026, the Monroe family and Alaska Wildlife Management agencies reflected on the progress made in wilderness safety education and emergency response capabilities. While no single incident could be completely prevented, the lessons learned from Caleb and Ryan Monroe's deaths had contributed to improved safety for countless other outdoor enthusiasts who ventured into Alaska's magnificent but dangerous wilderness areas. The Monroe brothers' legacy lived on through the lives they had touched during their brief time on Earth, the safety improvements their tragic deaths had inspired, and the ongoing work of the Memorial Foundation established in their honor. Their story served as both a cautionary tale about the risks inherent in wilderness recreation and a tribute to the courage and spirit of adventure that drew them to Alaska's remote and beautiful hunting grounds, where they ultimately gave their lives. The November 3rd, 2025 attack that claimed the lives of Caleb and Ryan Monroe would be remembered as one of Alaska's most tragic human-wildlife encounters, but also as a catalyst for positive changes in wilderness safety education, emergency response procedures, and wildlife management practices. Their deaths were not in vain if they prevented even one similar tragedy from occurring in Alaska's vast and unforgiving wilderness. In the end, the brothers died doing what they loved in a place that had brought their family joy for 3 generations, and their memory would continue to inspire both caution and adventure in those who followed their footsteps into the Alaska wilderness. The massive Kodiak bear that destroyed their cabin and ended their lives represented the raw power and unpredictability of nature that makes Alaska both magnificent and dangerous, reminding all who heard their story that humans remain small and vulnerable when confronted with the full force of the natural world. The story of November 3rd, 2025, when a Kodiak bear destroyed a cabin and killed 2 hunters in Alaska wilderness, would be told and retold for generations as both a tragedy and a lesson, ensuring that Caleb and Ryan Monroe's names would never be forgotten by those who loved them and those who learned from their ultimate sacrifice to the wild places they cherished above all else.